Hello everyone, thank you so much for being in the room on time. I like to start on time so that we can have maximum opportunity for the discussion points. And thank you to all of you joining us online. I know that there are plenty of you joining us online, and welcome to this 2-day event, or 1.5-day event. We've had a lovely morning. We've been working, but some of you have probably explored the coastline that is Nice. And of course the coastline is why we're here. We're going to talk about financing coastal resilience. This is the second edition of Adaptation Days, and we are delighted to be here in the beautiful amphitheatre of EDHEC here in the south of France. And for those joining online, we are working. We're not outside exploring the coastline of Nice. We are working here inside. And I'm sure many of us are remembering days when we had exams. We don't have to take any exams this time. But of course, what you have to do is perhaps more important. You have to think about solutions in order to help those who are living in coastal regions in all sorts of ways, the adaptation, and we will come across that in all sorts of ways in the next couple of days. The event is the European Commission and, of course, the European Investment Bank. And the conference is adjoined. It's not random that these 2 days have been chosen. We're here because next week is the UN's Ocean Conference. So it is just adjoining that. It's thinking about that in different ways, but of course it is because that is also happening next week. It's split into two parts. So today we will think more technically. We'll have some really wonderful in-depth panel discussions, presentations from experts, testimonials from experts, and we want it to be highly interactive. So please ask as many questions as you like, as time permits, time being very, very important indeed. And also to those of you online, we will also monitor your questions, and feel free to send in as many questions as you like, and we'll get through, the moderators of the panel discussions will get through as many questions as they possibly can. Just say your name and which organization or institution you're from, and we'll develop the questions as well. So who's in the room, who's online? We have climate experts, we have policy makers, public officials, business leaders, and we're all here to talk about the problems that the sea level rise is having on coastal regions, happening today, and how to invest in more resilient coastal economies. There are plenty of opportunities. I know you've already participated in some of these opportunities. I got the chance to meet some of you last night, and there'll be plenty of opportunities to talk and to meet each other in bilateral, more informal conversations outside the room. We've got a few coffee breaks. We've also got tonight and tomorrow as well. So plenty of places and opportunities for you to discuss more in informal settings, and of course that networking opportunities where real business can sometimes happen. Some housekeeping rules. It is going to be recorded. You will have access to all of the recordings after the event and any of the slides that are used by the speakers as well. To continue the conversation online, if you want to take any photos, feel free to do so. You've all signed up to allow photos to be taken, and the hashtag is Adaptation Days, so that you can continue the conversation through whatever social media platform you like. But to start, that's all from me. I will be the thread through the 2-day event, but of course it's over to the experts now, and I'm delighted to welcome on stage our first speaker of the day, who is the EDHEC Climate Institute Macroeconomist and Senior Research Engineer Nicolas Schneider, and he's going to talk about coastlines at risk, unveiling the value and vulnerability of coastal areas in a warming world. So Nicolas, the stage is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. My name is Nicolas Schneider. I am working under the management of Anthony Schrapfer and Camille Anguet. I'm in charge of the physical risk of the EDHEC Climate Institute. And today, I hope that you will enjoy the keynote presentation about framing the key issues on climate adaptation and coastal climate impacts. So the main goal today will be basically to bring you from a global perspective, introductory topic, all the way down to the nature of climate adaptation, what does it mean when we're talking about cost, and more importantly, we will end, after the Q&A and the panel, we will end the session with an application to show you not only what data we're using, how to process it, and what we are going to do with this data to get the implication quantified of climate change adaptation. And so I would like to start today with the first element, which is you all have heard about this heavily advertised globally average climate matrix, 1.5 degree above pre-industrial level. And in practice, the main goal of today, and I think the spatial information we're trying to present, is to tell you that climate change impacts space heterogeneously. What does it imply? Some places have already experienced 1.5 degree anomaly way before than others. If climate impacts space heterogeneously, it implies that if we can get granular information about the local distribution of climate information, we can identify the heterogeneous adaptation needs and costs of industries, sectors, particularly in coastal area. Is it okay with the microphone? I feel I'm yelling in the microphone. No? Good? Perfect. Okay. So let's do a little bit of background. So I'm going to present to you, I'm sure most of you are aware of that, the concept of physical risks. So basically, the physical segment of climate risks is constituted of acute and chronic risks. Acute, we're talking about the extreme event causing immediate disruptions on supply chains, industries. Chronic risks, we are talking about the long-term stochastic warming process that follows an upward trend, basically the long-term effect of climate change, mainly on productivity. And the idea is to try to distinguish these events separately in an empirical model and understand the different temporality of climate change. Immediate, short run, long-term, chronic, okay? So, of course, we all talking about adaptation today, but to understand funding adaptation, we need to know its cost. And to understand the cost, we need to know the exposure. And so this is where climate data, and in particularly what we're doing at the EDHEC Climate Institute, finds its contribution, okay? So I am gonna follow with 3 questions from investors seeking regional climate risk solutions. The main goal of today's presentation, if you could get out of the door with 3 key messages we're trying to answer today, are: what is the size of future localized climate shocks? How do they distribute spatially? How do they scale up globally and at the country level? Second, how much will it cost? We are talking about the socio-economic implication of climate change. Third, who will pay for it? And that is something very important to have. We are not only processing data to have fun. Actually, processing data is quite boring. The idea of processing data and accessing data is not only to do fancy maps, is to use, compress, collapse, transform this data, use it in a model that gives you quantified implication of climate risks. If I tell you tomorrow, you're mayor of a city, and I know maybe some of them are watching today. If I tell you today that in 2030 it's going to be warmer where you are, you could answer, so what? The main goal today is to tell you that we can quantify the socio-economic energy demand implications of this warmer future we're projecting for you, which is way more relevant and has far-reaching policy implications for a mayor, okay? So what you can see in front of you is basically a map of administrative area level 1. So those are basically the provinces level, equivalent in France of Région PACA. And we are able, for each of these regions, to actually compress, capture, extract granular data information. And now, since we're swimming in data, there is a sort of spatial momentum we can capture On the left-hand side is a map. On the right-hand side is an example of localized information that is now available to any users for free. But yet, what do we know already? First, there is a rising intensity and frequency of climate shocks. Second, climate impacts space heterogeneously. You all probably are aware, 2025 January, we saw historic catastrophic wildfires in California. A few hundreds of miles away in Texas, historical snowstorms. Why? Because climate change is disrupting the distribution of extreme events. And an important part of it is to say, well, if we want to quantify the heterogeneous adaptation needs of cities in coastal area, of sectors in coastal area, of industries in coastal area, we must account for the local events happening where these industries are. We cannot rely anymore on globalized measure of future damages. If I tell you as a mayor of a city that tomorrow we suspect that there are going to be a globally average damages of 7%, so what? So what? So the idea is really to bring in some localized element because this is way more practical. So another question you're going to ask me, and I think I will answer it right away, is why are we doing that? And so we're doing that basically in a shorter answer because we can. And the ultimate fundamental goal of also today's keynote is to tell you that now we can. We have the data availability, we have the computing power to process it and store it, we have the methodologies to collapse it and put it in a empirical model, and we have the theory to understand the interpretation of the implication of these models. And so the main goal in doing that will be to basically present you three different, I will say not case study, but basically to give you an idea of the heterogeneous effect of climate across sectors. Let's take the first most obvious sector. Energy consumption in coastal area, but also anywhere, is an adaptation strategy to outdoor temperature for heating and cooling. So this is an extremely weather-dependent sector. What we know is that on the demand side, climate change is shifting the distribution of extreme heat events, making them more frequent and intense over time. And so it's triggering the electricity needs in the summer. Climate change is also moderating low temperature, cold season extremes. And as a matter of fact, it's also reducing the gas demands for the winter. There is a net annual effect that is extremely ambiguous, absolutely determined by your location, latitude and longitude, which is adaptation using energy will, at the building level, create massive energy demand implications for the entire sector. Now, if you scale it up at the city level or even at the country level, we are now talking about huge amount of quantities. Second element, supply side acute risks. Hurricane, extreme weather events are also impacting the electricity grids by creating disruptions and shutdown. Now, something to have in mind, and you probably are observing it right now, the energy sector is one of these sectors where climate adaptation and mitigation can conflict. Why? It is warmer. The city of New York is pumping way more energy to adapt to outdoor temperature. Rising temperature is reducing energy productivity of the building. You consume more, you emit more. You emit more, it's warmer. It's warmer, you consume more. And so what is very important to understand is when people are talking about electrification of gas heating system, and at the same time about climate adaptation, it is putting an enormous amount of pressure on the electricity grid. Understanding climate adaptation is also understanding that for the case of energy demand, the cost is borne by people. People have an unequal access to adaptation based on their socioeconomic conditions. I'm going to be a little bit pessimistic here, but there are some areas in the future, in some high latitude or in some low latitude places where the most vulnerable people with the lowest socioeconomic condition will be heavily impacted by climate change. And we are talking about health. Long-term exposure to high temperature is producing long-term effect on your health. If you're a vulnerable person, this will have effect on you, unless you can afford the cost of adaptation. But not everyone can. Second element will be cropland productivity. So basically, there is a huge trend of the literature that has been working on this. And on the left-hand side, you can see basically how we understand the relationship between temperature and cropland productivity, crop yields. What we know is that there is a nonlinear relationship and a threshold after which a standard deviation increase in average temperature is producing damages on cropland productivity. On the right-hand side is actually the spatial distribution of crop calorie supply impacts of climate change. The main idea is to tell you weather is changing, soil is also changing, it is producing crop yield declines that will have, at the aggregate level, major implication for crop calorie supply, food prices, land supply, land prices in coastal area. Now, all of this can be modulated by farmers' adaptation, irrigation, it is endogenous to the climate itself, pesticides, and shifting crop calendars and crop varieties. Now, the last element, which is a very unknown segment of the agriculture sector, and it does apply very well to coastal area, is the potentially offsetting effect of carbon fertilization. As we all know, most SSP forecast high, elevated, rising carbon dioxide emission concentration above the ground in the future. This will likely also feed plants. There is an extremely unambiguous effect about the potentially partial offsetting effect of carbon dioxide emission in coastal area. Without granular data, you cannot answer this question. Simple. Over the last 20 years, only one empirical econometric paper has included carbon dioxide emission. But wait a minute, we know the photosynthesis. It's a well-known relationship. Plants need water, sun, and carbon dioxide emission. And so you can see that now granular data is also conflicting with some methodological challenges, because in econometric work, it is very hard to work with this kind of carbon dioxide emission data on the right-hand side of your equation. I'm not going to go more technically about that, but this will have major implication for the sector in general and food security of coastal area. Now, the infrastructure assets is also a well-known segment of the economy. We know that facing sea level rise, there will be major investment needed in hard infrastructure, like seawalls, etc. And of course, without adequate granular information, it is extremely difficult to understand the implication for coastal adaptation. So now I've showed you basically micro level, sector level productivity losses from climate change. And the main idea today is to bring you all the way to climate scenario. We are recording at the industry level productivity losses, which together over the long term scale up to generate production losses at the country level. Hence why it is very important to have a good understanding of the relationship between average temperature and GDP for all countries. These productivity losses can be aggregated up to build a damage function, a very famous one, the one from Burke and al. Is right here in front of you, to really understand the relationship between emission, change in temperature, and damages. Now, something that is critical in that case is to be able to understand that these damages can only be computed with granular information. Now, you could ask me a question, which is, why are we doing this? Well, essentially, physical damages are what motivate transition investments. Without damages, you have no incentive to reduce your emissions. And so the goal of doing that is to tell you that we started from the local level, sector level, we've been able to aggregate up all the way to the country level, and now we understand why damage function in integrated assessment models, climate scenario, are key. Without damages, you have no incentive to reduce emissions. Now, of course, you are observing rising before your eyes two different temporalities. Coastal areas have to manage investment in mitigation and adaptation simultaneously, but as well over different windows. Reducing emission today will allow you to curb and avoid catastrophic scenario by end century. However, there is a temporal gap during which we will be impacted. The only way to mitigate and modulate this impact is by adaptation. To know how much you need to fund your adaptation, again, you need to know the adaptation cost, which is inherently determined by your sector and your region. To know the adaptation cost, you need to know your exposure. To know your exposure, you need to have access to granular information. If I tell you that your exposure is the global average, you will tell me, so what? So basically, after that, we are trying to convince you that extracting, processing regional, coastal, asset-level, sectoral insights can be extremely useful to a wide range of users. First, the policymakers. It could give them a comparative informational advantage, or what some people would call a first-mover advantage, because basically, policymakers can now secure long-term energy supply contracts. If I can tell you what will be the impact of climate change on both your supply and demand side determinants of your energy production, you will be more likely to secure energy contract over the long term because you have this information. Also, ensures the future insurability of their strategic infrastructure, airport, and potentially tackles the topic of relocation. So another important part is talking to investors and private asset owners. They need to protect themselves against potential losses in equity portfolio, but more importantly, to understand that if climate change is impacting the productivity of local plants, that is a revenue loss, an increase in production costs that will have major effect for the cost forecast of the revenue of the company. And so something that is very important as well is the insurance sector. You have all heard probably recently, that they've made basically an estimation of the absolute cost of the wildfires in Los Angeles in January 2025. In the near future, some people will not afford either the cost of adaptation or the cost of insurance. Insurance will stop insuring some people unless they are willing to pay for a premium. That will cause major intra-country migration, which is a very overlooked topic of climate change, which is people who cannot afford the cost of insurance will move. This will have major effects on the land prices and supply of coastal area. And I think that Los Angeles is one of them. And finally, the concept of judiciarization, which is basically the fact that more and more investors will need to have disclosed to them the climate risk exposure of the company and the mitigation as well as the adaptation strategies that will be implemented by the company. There is an increasing risk for companies that do not disclose these elements to be legally sued. Before the Trump administration, there was something called climate disclosure in America that came out, I think, in 2023. And the main goal, one of it, was to partially meet this target. So I think this is all for me for now. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we are good on time. If I could summarize all of it with one short sentence that I hope underlines many more sentences, which will be why we're doing that, and the small, even smaller answer I can give you today, which I hope will summarize the explicit goal of today's conference, is because now we can. And processing data is not only here for fun, it is meant to be used with the adequate methodologies to draw the economic implication of climate change adaptation. And I'm available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicolas. So I know that we have a member of the team who's monitoring any online questions. I don't know if there have been any questions sent in online, and otherwise questions from the floor here. I know it's post-lunch, but we didn't have a morning session, so I'm hoping that we have a lot of questions from the floor here.
No question?
Yes, Roman. Corinne has a microphone. She's running very fast towards you. I know I'm going to introduce you in just a moment, but for those who don't know you, Roman, do you want to give a line to introduce yourself first?
I can. Hi, everyone. My name is Roman Röhrl. I'm an adaptation specialist at the EIB, and I'll be moderating the next session. So I'll break the ice with the first question. Thank you, Nicolas, for the input. I like your point about the damage information as a motivator for both mitigation and adaptation. You also mentioned the disclosure regulation that, it was a movement around major economies until up recently. Now it's under revision. How would you see the general availability for researchers such as yourself on damage data from countries and companies? How is that availability in your mind? Does it need to be improved, or is it already on a good trajectory?
Well, I hope give a simple answer, but this is a very complex question. Any company has a cost function. And unfortunately, even the most climate skeptical people will at some point have to question and incorporate the future productivity losses caused by climate change. And therefore, these damages, beyond being, sharing them, being part of a little political movement, the idea is also to give information to people of the environmental determinants of economic production and sectoral production. So far, you have all heard about the technical aspect of production in industries, and I think the main goal is to tell you that for many sectors, energy, agriculture be two of them, the environmental determinants of production are major. If you are unable to quantify them, you will very likely miss your forecast in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question, and again, just say your name and where you're from.
Hi, everyone. Working? Yeah. Hi, my name is Michael Back. I'm working with the Global...
Sorry, Michael, it's not working yet.
No? Can you hear me?
New microphone.
Hello? Hello?
Is it switched on?
Hello? Just don't touch it. That is the instruction. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Back. I work with the... Oh, now it's working. Global Green Growth Institute. I'm based in Seoul. Happy to be here. So as someone who doesn't work as much in Europe as the rest of you, I'm really interested in this example, and especially some of the crop modeling that you're talking about. So from this damage perspective, and using that as a basis, we know that infrastructure has requirements around insurance, but we find, I guess I'm interested in the examples in Europe. Are there mandates for agricultural insurance, or what are like the pressures driving that, as this is much more about the uptake of farmers, right? And how do maybe those pressures compare with what we see in infrastructure?
Thank you very much. So basically, I don't know if you heard recently, but some farmers in the United States sued the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, for non-access to key climate information because of the Trump presidency. And so something important to have in mind is that access to climate information is key, particularly for farmers who need to plan the growing season and the planting as well as harvesting periods. This is going to shift in the future due to climate change. There is something that will be called the new era of insurance, which does apply very well to the agricultural sector, is parametric insurance, which I'm sure some of you are aware of it. Parametric insurance basically allows you to identify, using granular information, what I would call threshold, des effets de seuil in French. And these thresholds, once reached, allow you to basically fund indemnizations of farmers on the ground automatically. And so something that is very critical in that point is that for people who were expected to be damaged and were not damaged, it shows evidence of excellent adaptation, they are rewarded. For people that are very at risk due to their specific geographic location, they will have to pay a premium. And so something that is very important and very interesting with this parametric insurance, it does apply very well to crop because we are really able to tailor coverage to the specific climate condition happening on the ground over the growing season for specific farmer and crop varieties. There is something that is important in that case, and I think, I'm going to say it several times, at some point you will be bothered, but I think it's very important, is the fact that granular information is not only here to have fun, it is meant to be used with the right model to quantify economic implication for the sectors. And so it's moving from it's going to be warmer to this is your land productivity losses locally to this is the aggregation of your losses at the country level all the way to understand the impacts in absolute terms, 1,000 tons for crops, and in the very end, impacts in terms of monetary value, financial materiality, all the way down to probably the implication on inflation, land prices, etc., etc. So there is a whole supply chain that goes with the granular data.
Thank you. We have a lady with the microphone, and then we'll go to you.
Yes, thank you. Linda Hölscher from Adelphi, based in Berlin. I have a question about data availability for climate risk assessments. So you showed that you need the climate hazard data, where we have the projections for the future, but also exposure and vulnerability data. And in my experience, it's much harder to find future scenarios and projections for exposure and vulnerability data. So I'm just interested in your estimation on that. What kind of data sources are available?
So this is a very important question. We've been talking about granular information. I haven't talked about the size. Unfortunately, some of this data requires extensive computing power because these data sets are huge. You have to imagine huge Excel files that are giving you, for instance, I'm going to give the example of NASA's next GGDP CMEP6 information. Behind that keyword, very smart people, way smarter than us, have been able to basically downscale over time by the overspace to the 0.25 degree resolution climate forecast, the long-term stochastic trajectory of climate change, and to offer daily information from 2015 to 2100. 2015 to 2100 times 30 global climate model times 4 socioeconomic scenario, SSP or CP, times 6 weather components, temperature, precipitation, specific humidity, solar radiation, wind speed, etc., etc., times the number of locations you have, 250,000, gives you something in billions, terabyte level. And so definitely one of the big challenges we have now is to be able to process reduced form of this data and make it accessible to everyone, not only to use, but potentially to use the output of this data. So directly the implication. That is a huge challenge, and I think this is where there is a sort of cloud computing revolution going on right now. The access to Amazon's supercomputers is that basically this data comes at a cost, and there is a data management progress to make, and probably some of you will ask about AI, and it could have some benefit effect, and maybe not, we will see.
And quantum computing to come as well, which costs energy too. We have questions online.
Yes, thank you. I have 2 questions from the audience online, from the streaming.
And who are you, just in case?
Oh, I'm sorry. I am Esther Badiola. I work for the EIB.
And she has put together everything along with a great team. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you very much. So the first question comes from, sorry, I lost it now. Here. The first question comes from Hassem, senior climate economist from Allianz Economic Research. And he's asking, I think, with all this vast amount of information that we have now, can private capital finance adaptation, or must it be the public and development institutions? Do they need to take the lead? So how would you split the action between the private sector and the public sector?
Wow, if I only knew. This is a very comprehensive question. I'm going to give you a few answers, and I hope they're going to be structured together at the very end. Okay. So there is a market rising right now about climate risk solution. You probably have heard about companies that I'm not going to mention, but these companies are rising on the wave of making granular information, climate risk assessment available to customers, companies. And these companies, some of them started another real estate business. There is some startup which call themselves scale-up, it's a new keyword, and these scale-up are basically developing this form of climate risk assessment directly for customers and companies. But again, it's because some of them also projected that this climate risk disclosure will be mandatory. Some of it is not anymore mandatory in the United States. So there is some market issue coming up from regulation. What is sure is that adaptation, to my point, that should be borne by the individuals in cities, for instance, should be carried by the public services. Why? Again, energy consumption is a way to modulate the effect of climate change on your health. Long-term exposure to extreme heat causes major implication on your health. The health epidemiological literature has already made a lot of research about that. If you are unable to bear the cost of adaptation, some of the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable location with the lowest socioeconomic background will die. And so that is something to really understand, to make the distinction between the cost of adaptation carried by individuals in cities, the cost of adaptation carried by small companies, and the cost of adaptation carried by major sectors and players in the business. And I think that would be my answer.
Thank you, Nicolas. We have 5 minutes left before Roman joins us on stage. I've got 2 questions here. We've got another question online and a lady here as well. So I'll try to take as many questions as quickly as possible and then the answers.
Thank you very much. My name is Gareth Phillips. I'm from the African Development Bank. Nicolas, thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. There's been a big reference to insurance. It's a major adaptation strategy. It's not one that we have access to in most African countries, and we're trying to develop these systems. But if I were, running an insurance company, I'd be thinking, I'm going to get hit for these risks. So either I'm going to put my policies up and make them more expensive, or I'm not going to offer climate-related insurance. What do you see as the best option? How is the insurance industry going to develop in the future?
So you say the best option, I'm repeating for everyone, the best option between stopping to insure or increasing the cost. I would say it's very important to make the distinction between the people that will be hit are not always the same as the people who will be able to pay. And I think this is where we draw the difference, is the fact that, unfortunately, in many places, insurance, to my view, will stop insuring. Because some of them will say, look, the rising frequency of extreme heat events, for instance, are entering the normal distribution of the events. This is not anymore a random element. It's every year, every month. And so some of them, I think, will update their general conditions for customer to be able to avoid the market. Others will be able to see a sort of premiums in insuring, for instance, some people in Pacific Palisades, Los Angeles. It was a very wealthy area of California. And some insurance will see definitely a benefit in insuring your home, but once again, they will insure it against a huge premium. Second, you will have a lot of conditions that will apply to you. No more trees around your house, specific materials for your infrastructure to be built on. It's already happening in Colorado. And so we will see probably a major change in the insurance industry. But in the very end, it does not hide the main intra-country migration that will happen. And this intra-country migration will have major effects. And so insurance is definitely a key business, but I would say the parametric insurance revolution is also kind of changing the game in the, I would say, a rational approach to some extreme events. It does require a lot of technical modeling and data, but there is some benefits to it, at least locally.
Thank you, Nicolas. Looking at the time, I know that I will take the next 3 questions in succession, and then you can remember them. Roman can remember them. Or you can write them down. And then hopefully they can be answered in the next panel discussion. So, first question here.
So, thank you. My name is Edwin Lau. I'm the head of the Blue Dot Network Secretariat based in Paris. My question is a little bit similar to the one from Allianz, which is that, this public-private distinction, I strongly agree with you in terms of the importance of the granularity of data, but some of this is commercial data. So is there a role for governments in making this, encouraging this data to be disclosed for policy-making purposes? Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take the one. No, it's okay. And then we'll take the question online.
Yes, I'm going to put 2 questions together from Dr. Zainab Umar from the Central Bank of Nigeria and Ted Bartholomew from EDHEC. They are referring to the regions where the dangers or the damage and financial impact are more chronic and where the access to data is weaker or fragmented, as in some sub-Saharan Africa. So how can we make sure that still this data can inform policy decisions?
And the final question to take here.
Thank you. Jan Brook from PIANC, the World Association for Waterborne Transport Infrastructure. I was just going to come back to the early questions about data and availability of data on damages. And what we see within the transport sector is, particularly with the ports, is that when there's an extreme event, the focus is very much on getting back up and running. And so when you talk to people afterwards, they will know what the insurance cost was, but they won't know what the additional cleanup costs, the maintenance costs, everything else, what the impact was on the supply chain. That then has a knock-on implication for when they're coming to justify investment in strength and resilience, because they don't actually know the cost of the true cost of the event. And further, when you look at using metrics to try and measure the effectiveness of adaptation measures, people, by that time, they're up and running, so they don't actually record what might have happened if they hadn't had the resilience measures in place. So what we see in the transport sector is some real challenges here in getting this information. And I just wondered whether that's common in other sectors or whether that's unique to transport.
Well, thank you. We've had quite a number of things for you to think about. Why don't you take a seat and ponder those whilst I invite Roman up to the stage and his panel. So thank you again, Nicolas, for that wonderful talk and all of the answers. And now it's a great pleasure to invite to the stage Roman Röhl, who is an EIB expert on climate adaptation and currently working with the Copernicus climate data systems to facilitate the appraisal of investment projects. And Roman, you are going to be joined on your panel by Torsten Kiefer, who is the Executive Director from JPI Oceans, Natalia Mangondo, Sustainable Finance for Nature Lead Grid Arendal, and Simone Quartini, Economist, Scientific Project Officer, Blue Economy, Directorate for Sustainable Resources, Ocean and Water Unit, Joint Research Centre at the European Commission. You have a long title, Simone. Over to you, Roman.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, everyone, welcome to the masterclass on data and coastal resilience. We've decided to program the first masterclass on data for a specific reason. And the reason is, when we talk about resilience and climate change and adaptation, we often, we end up in a very gloomy picture where we look at impacts and we look at climate change as an almost insurmountable problem. Emissions keep rising, and it can be a very, hopeless view into the future that you arrive with. But why we like talking about data is because data gives us agency to the problem. It is a technical subject matter for sure, but it's also the place where, me personally, where I take most hope for what we can do about getting through this problem that climate change is. Data guides us to the solution, right? It's not data alone, but it's often the starting point, as we heard from Nicolas and others. And it gives us agency and a way forward to protect ourselves and our societies before we hopefully stabilize the atmosphere and climate again. And that's why data is the perfect point to start this conference. It gives us the tools to find the solutions, locate the solutions that we hopefully then later can implement. And with that spirit, basically, I'd like to start the panel. My job would have been to introduce all the panelists, but Lisa already did this, which is a great thing. Thanks for doing this. It saved us time, so you will have more time to listen to our panelists and quiz their brains and make the most out of this session. It will be interactive, so we will be relying on you again to come up with smart questions. We'll have one panelist after the other, starting with a small short input about their work and the highlights that they think are relevant for you in the audience and for the event today and tomorrow. And then you will have the opportunity to questions. And then we'll close again with Nicolas, who will take us through a deep dive on where the data is actually coming from and how data is processed, so that it hopefully can drive action in the world. So let's start with Thorsten Kiefer. The floor is yours.
Good. Thank you very much. Do you navigate to the first slide of mine? Let's see. I do. Okay, good. I'll try to do like Nicolas and do this kind of promenading across the stage a little bit, because I actually like it, but I probably have to navigate. Anyways, yeah, my name is Thorsten Kiefer. I'm from JPI Oceans, a platform of countries, pan-European platform of countries to align research and innovation priorities and then follow up with action on it. And I'll dive deeper into one specific action that is very much on the topic of data granularity. So this is probably a figure you have seen or something similar. So basically I'm introducing, like Nicolas, fantastic data, which are, however, at the global level. So IPCC has done this incredible work. You see the historical sea level rise based on observational data, and then modeling data based on the different scenarios and so on. That's fantastic. But then, if you are a decision maker and an adaptation planner and an urban planner or so, this might be of limited use to you. So the task ahead is to break down that information to something that is more usable at the local scale, also temporal scale, maybe also looking more into impacts and so on. And this is exactly what we set out to do by producing, and this is it, the first, now what do we call it? The first assessment report of the Knowledge Hub on sea level rise in Europe. Did I get that right? Yeah, approximately. Right, so here it is to be touched. It's quite thick, so it was quite an effort. It took us several years. And if I'm saying we, what I mean is JPI Oceans, my own organization, and the one I'm heading, and a partner organization, JPI Climate. These are countries, so there were a lineup of countries on board, 9 of them who found this to be really worthwhile to pursue and invest in it. Then engaged in the order of 70 experts on sea level rise from those countries. Also some organizations who put in cash to pay for some of the work. And finally, this was also, because we're here close to the UN event, endorsed by the UN Ocean Decade. The point we wanted to make is that with this report, we want to provide regional specificity, and we wanted to go beyond just rising waters as an element of sea level. There's much more to it. There's floods, there's shoreline changes, and so on. We also wanted to go just beyond to pure physics, which is more than what IPCC does. There's these whole socio-economic components to it. So we try to cover these elements. Before we actually started writing the report, we sought the conversation with stakeholders and users, practitioners, and so on. So first of all, we did a stakeholder survey, sea basin by sea basin, to get a little bit the regional specificity, and then asked a lot of things. And that's just an example. Interesting finding, if you want, already, what is relevant to the practitioners there, and the darker red is more relevant, green is irrelevant. And you see that, for example, there's a strong relevance or perceived relevance of beach and coastal erosion in most sea basins. And in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, for example, public infrastructure damage is of major relevance. So it sounds like quite economically driven what is perceived as relevant, whereas, for example, inundation was perceived as much less relevant, which is remarkable. Right. What we also did was then hold workshops, actually, online workshops, where we put sea basin by sea basin. In total, I think it was about 250 people we consulted with, and we extracted information on what people would expect from such a report. They found that climate data are insufficient for local areas. They wanted to have a better understanding of extreme events, of hazards, want to have catalogued historical events. They wanted to have more clarity in adaptation methods and compare national policies and things such as that. Now I'm giving just a flavor of this whole report, what we've done. So the assessment report is breaking down data and information to the regional to local level, and these are now examples. Data broken down to the European level. For example, what is the present sea level rise relative to the ground? You can see here some details. For example, in the Baltic Sea, sea level rise it might actually locally be falling because the ground is lifting up. I mean, the first thing to realize is that sea level rise is like climate. Nicolas made it, they put the point for temperature increase. It's not a uniform pattern at all. The ground is in some areas rising, in others it is subsiding. Ocean currents, gravitational effects, and so on make a huge difference in sea level between one place and another. Yeah, so that's one figure. Another one is, for example, also the more going on extreme events. The historical 1 in 100-year sea level event in 2100 will be bad news for the Mediterranean region. So what is a 1 in 100-year event today, for example, Indies, might be a monthly to a daily event in 2100. So that is powerful information. We then even went down to the sea basin scale, so that's now figures for the Mediterranean, without going into detail. But we did that for each sea basin, so that you can really focus in on regional information. Beyond just the display of what sea level does, we then also provide information on impacts, and that's an example. As I said, there was a lot of concern about coastal erosion, so here's some information about coastal erosion with little dots for each area of the European coasts, and assessment of shoreline retreat in 2100 under high emission scenario. And we also looked into adaptation measures and decision-making principles. Try to assess the adaptation measures that are out there. 17 were different types were found, and a point was made to combine engineering and nature-based approaches and community involvement and adaptive management. And in the decision-making, a recommendation to be flexible with adaptation measures and put in place low-regret strategies. Basically, don't, as a decision-maker, you shouldn't lock yourself into an adaptation strategy where you cannot react to changing conditions or changing information later. For example, if you build your seawalls higher and higher, at some point you can't anymore. So you have to have a fallback strategy that where you don't lock yourself in. And finally, we also looked into sea level rise governance. There's no nice figures actually. This goes more into the social sciences, and they work more with tables. But there's a very nice, interesting compilation of information there about 22 coastal adaptation policies that were found, mostly national, but also some regional. And it's really interesting that among those, 6 of them consider sea level rise, and 16 actually don't. So there's a lot of what is that, education or information sharing to be done. And likewise, or similar with marine spatial planning policies, 11 of them consider sea level rise, 6 again don't, and 5 it wasn't even clear whether they do or they don't. So with that, I thank you. That was a brief glimpse into the sea level rise report. For us, after the report is before the report, so that was the first. It's not perfect. It can be done better, and now we're setting out to set up a new cycle, a second assessment report, and it's really great to be here and maybe seek engagement when we roll out this second report and the whole scoping of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thorsten. That was fascinating. Very important report. I have a ton of questions, but I'll behave. I'm not misusing my privilege as a moderator, and I'll give the floor to the audience first. Who has a question for Thorsten on this report? Frank? I see Frank.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Frank Jesus from the EIB. I have a question because very often when we think about coastal resilience, the first thing in terms of hazards that come are coastal erosion, storm surges, sea level rise. What about saline intrusion? I don't hear so much talked about saline intrusion, despite the fact that it's going to be very insidious in the sense that it will affect the access to fresh water for people living in the area, for agriculture, depending on water in the area, etc. So how do you compare what's been presented and studied so far and the impact of saline intrusion? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. It is an issue. What is interesting is what in the stakeholder conversations that I presented, saltwater intrusion was actually not a big concern, probably because of ignorance or so, or lack of information. We do actually have saltwater intrusion information in the report, so it is addressed. Maybe not at the level of other impacts. And I think one thing that the report hopefully will do, or the report cycles, is first of all increase the sensitivity about impacts, exactly that people are aware what their risks actually are, and secondly also to inspire research into certain areas where there's maybe not yet that great information, as is the case here.
Thank you. I see there are questions from the online participants. Esther?
Yes, thank you very much, Thorsten. We have a question, I think it's coming from the US, from Mr. or Mrs. Beskin. They are concerned about how does this all translate into methodologies to assess coastal properties, the value or the impacts in coastal properties. How does this inform all these private sector decisions at the end?
Wow, it's a super great question. I can't give a conclusive answer that because we're putting the information out there, and at the moment it is more targeted at the, if you talk about granularity, at the target groups, the sectors, the towns, the administrations, and so on. But it is true that maybe to really progress with transformation of climate change mitigation and adaptation, large scale, maybe we have to reduce the granularity also of the target group. Because every individual and every family actually makes their economic decisions. And if we don't have them on board, if they don't have the appropriate information, probably they might, well, just keep going and not participate in a transformation. Right, okay, so that's a little philosophical answer. The other part of the answer might be that this is, as I said, this is the first report. It's not perfect yet, but it's also an inspiration. And I would say that the second version of the report might have something more interactive, where you can actually zoom into your area and really get detailed information, kind of live information, and so on. That helps your decision making, whether you should purchase a villa or whatever house, or near the coast or so. And I've seen actually results from a project called Coquelicot, where this is already pretty much for developed, where you can where you have a dashboard basically to access information. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Thorsten. I think we're at time, and we need to move on to the next panelists. Thank you so much for those insights in the report. I think I would have had actually a lot of questions, but maybe we can explore further after the session, you know, what the EIB can learn from the report, where the investment needs might be, or how we can use the report to identify them, to promote, you know, cost resilience in Europe. But I want to ask one last question. Is there something similar available for the global geographies, or is it only available for Europe?
To all my knowledge, it's only available for Europe yet. However, we already inspired some interest. We are now getting in touch with someone from University of Hong Kong who actually wants to do a similar process for what is that, and Southeast Asia, or probably not all of Asia, but I don't know yet exactly. So we are setting up an example and developing a methodology that we're very happy actually to transport to other regions.
Okay, fantastic. Let's give a round of applause to Thorsten Kiefer. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to come to Natalie. Do you have a microphone? Yes, fantastic. Natalie, I know you're working with Grid Arendal, UNEP, a lot on the interface between climate finance and how it can, you know, inform and enable policy implementation and governance, including in sustainable ocean planning. And you have brought an input for us as well. So we're very curious to hear what you brought us here today. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Natalie Mangondo, and I lead the nature finance work at Grid Arendal. And so Roman outlined a little bit about my work, but essentially what I do is I make investment cases and develop climate finance policy for the most challenging contexts in the world. And I do this in regions where resources are really scarce, but where there's high levels of national priorities and community-driven solutions. And so in my career, I've worked with countless governments, grassroots organizations, but I've reached my greatest challenge yet, and that's really in working with scientists, because it's a challenge. Scientists, while they have the data, they have the tools, And I'd argue that they have the solutions. Sometimes when I speak to the scientists, the researchers, and the academics in my team, it seems like we're speaking a entirely different language. And so that's really my role at GRID, is to ensure that we can translate this into something that financiers can understand and want to invest in. So I guess based on that, the question then becomes, what if the problem isn't necessarily a lack of ocean solutions, but a failure to structure the data in ways that finance can actually act on? Because as everyone in this room knows, we do know what needs to be done. Decades of science has told us exactly where we need to act in terms of ecosystem protection as well as community engagement, and how to restore and protect these areas. But the funding still isn't flowing where it needs to be, at the pace or the scale. And the question on that is why? And so I'd argue that the missing link is really in terms of how we structure and how we communicate data, so that governments, businesses, communities, and investors can actually make informed decisions. And so at GRID Arendal, what we do is we work at the science policy interface, and we translate complex environmental data into insights that can inform policy, guide investment, and empower local action. And my job there is essentially to be a translator. So this is between the world of science as well as the world of capital, and translating ecological data into evidence-based investment cases to the world's greatest challenges. And we don't have time to cover everything in detail, so I'm going to try give you 3 high-level messages that you can take away from this discussion. The audience is very varied, and so I don't want your eyes to glaze over, so I'm going to keep it high level so that it's understandable for most people across your areas of expertise. The first message I want to leave you with is the kind of data that we actually need to unlock capital, because it's not enough to have this alarm going off about how the ocean is under threat. What we need to do is to show how restoring it reduces risk as well as drives value in order to unlock finance. And then the second area is how to structure that data so that it can be put into decision-grade knowledge that can then be applied and aligned with policy as well as investment. And then the third thing I want to do is give you a simple case study of how we're doing this under a new partnership under the United Nations Oceans Decades Program. So if we move to the first point, and we try to make it more concrete, what I want to try to do is try to walk you through a day in the life of me navigating between scientists and financiers who often ask very different but kind of related questions. And so in my day-to-day, a scientist might ask, where are the mangroves? And then the financier asks, how much carbon do they store and what's it worth? And so this gives investors an idea of the revenue stream or the asset valuation that they're after. Another scientist might ask, what's the condition of the reef? And then the financier asks, what's the costs like storm damage or insurance claims that were mentioned earlier that could be avoided if this reef is restored? Another scientist might measure how vulnerable a coastline is. And then financiers ask, what's the return on protecting it? And there you have your ROI. And oftentimes science reports on how fast sea level is rising. And then financiers would ask how infrastructure is at risk and what the cost is, what the value of what would be lost is. And that gets you to your risk exposure and asset to at-risk value. And so it's clear, I think, from the previous presenters that there's an abundance of useful data that exists. But what we need to do is frame it through a financial decision-making lens. Otherwise, the funds won't flow to where they're needed most. And so I think it's that translation from these scientific insights into investable relevance that is the bridge that we need to really build in the coming years. The second thing I want to address is how to turn raw ocean and climate data into something that financiers and policymakers can actually act on. And so they would want to act on something that we call decision-grade intelligence. And to do that, I like to use a simple framework. This is not the extent of it, but these are a few areas that we really need to tackle. The G is for granular, and this means that data needs to be high resolution as well as site-specific. We can't just talk in abstract about mangroves within a certain country. We need to get more specific, talking about carbon per hectare in a specific estuary, because this is what helps our risk, how to price risk accurately, as well as how to value our natural assets. The A is for attributable, and so another way of putting that is how actionable is it in practice? Can it shape a project? Can it support a permit application? Can it make the case for funding? And if not, to many investors, it's just background noise. And so then, in that case, it's not investment ready. The S is, of course, for standardized, and this is really about consistency, because if we can't plug this data into global frameworks like ESG metrics or TNFD reporting or national adaptation planning, then it's really hard to scale, hard to compare, as well as hard to credibly use. And then the last one is purposeful, aka designed for decision making. And so this means that data needs to be relevant to the real questions that decision makers are actually asking, which is, what's the risk, what's the return, what's the impact, what's feasible, etc. And so that's the GRASS framework, and these 4 qualities are what transforms interesting data into investable insights. And I think that's how we begin to structure the data that we need to finance the ocean that we want. So just to close off, I just want to take it back to the beginning of the question we started with. What if the problem isn't a lack of ocean solutions, but what if the problem is how we structure data that can't, in ways that finance can't actually act on? And so we've now explored at a high level the data we need, how it should be structured, but the next question is, how do we actually turn these high-level things into practice? And so at Grid Arendal, what we're doing is we've partnered with IOC UNESCO, the United Nations Environment Programme, World Wildlife Fund, Sustainable Blue Economy Partnership, and others to develop this new program under the Ocean Decades program to do exactly that. So this is called Sustainable Ocean Planning for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. And essentially what it is a full and global governance framework and implementation framework that helps countries to manage their marine space in a way that's strategic, that's science-based, and that's long-term. So what makes SOP different is that it brings together what we know, what we value, and what we fund into a single unified system rather than the fragmented system that we currently have. And you'll see that at the center of this framework is long-term outcome 3, which is adaptive, climate-smart, sustainable ocean planning, which is underpinned by the best available data. And it's not a coincidence that data is at the center of this framework, because for sustainable ocean planning, data isn't just an input. It's kind of like the engine that drives its sustainable ocean planning. And so it tells us where we are, where we're falling short, and what is possible if we actually do act. And the way that long-term outcome 3 is structured isn't about collecting more data. It's more about structuring what we currently have into the tools, into the dashboards, into the metrics that answer the questions that decision makers are actually asking. So that's which ecosystems offer the highest return on restoration, how can governments and investors co-finance with confidence, what reduces risk fastest, etc. And so if we think of sustainable ocean planning as kind of a beautiful fabric, the data is then the thread that weaves through the finance, the science, and the policy together into something that's coherent and resilient. And the great part is this doesn't just apply to ocean planning. We can then expand this type of thinking to developing investment-ready data for coastal resilience, for blue carbon, for climate adaptation planning, and beyond that. So I think it's clear from the previous panelists that the solutions are here, that the science is solid, but what's really missing is how we structure data in order to unlock finance. So I'll end off there and open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. That was awesome, actually. It was like you were reporting out of my life. And I've actually never seen anybody put it on a slide so concisely like that. Maybe we need a framework for communicating between, between science and finance and science and policymakers. I wonder if we actually have, scientific research on this, communication barrier, which goes all ways, right? It's not one way. Very fantastic input. Thank you so much. And yeah. Audience, what do you say? Any questions? There's a question over there. Thank you. Then I see the gentleman there.
Thank you for the great presentation. I'm Thibault. I'm working for BNP Paribas. We've seen a lot of challenge with the link between the capital and the project that you are explaining. Who do you think are the best risk takers, and where do you see their time horizon for investment? Because the differences between the time horizon of these ecological problems and the time horizon of investors might differ a little bit.
Yeah, so I can't necessarily identify the greatest risk taker, because I think that changes based on market conditions. But what I think is interesting is tools and mechanisms that allow us to reduce that risk on different parties. So, of course, blended finance is a big topic in the climate space already, and there's increasing interest in it in the ocean space. So I think what is interesting is being able to share the risk based on different risk tolerant preferences. So I wouldn't identify a specific risk taker within the space, because that's dependent on the market conditions, but I would like to see how we can share that risk. Does that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up? Okay.
Did you want to follow up? Did I get it's fine? Okay. Sorry, I have the gentleman over there next, and then I see you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a fascinating overview of how you're addressing the problem. I was interested, my name's Rob Arnold, I work for the EDHEC Climate Institute. I was wondering, you phrased the value of protecting coastal regions and the mangrove swamps example, for example, in terms of the benefits and the value you could deliver to the infrastructure. But of course, protecting ecosystems, you have a lot of other types of value added to agriculture, to in lots of other areas of economic activity. I was wondering how far are you going into trying to quantify those and create an integrated sort of assessment of value. And because you have so many diverse stakeholders who gain value out of that, and you're looking at financiers to invest in it, if you're trying to phrase it in terms of protecting infrastructure, you do have infrastructure investors who can who are willing to finance that. But when you have a much broader spectrum of interest, how are you going about trying to sort of integrate that into your analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of our approach, it is based on the full valuation of ecosystem services. So this is definitely a high-level overview, but we do also recognize that ecosystems provide other value that might not be captured by the current system. And in terms of your second question, do you mind repeating it, because I didn't get it clearly?
Well, I mean, when you're trying to seek financial mechanisms and create financial incentives to protect these areas, if you don't include all the value that you're getting from it. You risk undervaluing it and not being able to get sort of sufficient investment in to deliver your objectives. How do you go about reflecting the full value then?
Yeah, I think that's an ongoing challenge within the space, particularly when we're looking at, for example, carbon markets, specifically blue carbon markets. And we do see quite a lot of disparities, regional disparities, other disparities that can't necessarily be accounted for based on the metrics that are being applied. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that's a valuation question as much as it is kind of a geopolitical positioning type of question where there's a perceived difference in value between certain projects based on things outside of the standard metrics. And so I can't answer that one for you, but I do say that, you know, we're working to ensure that all the projects that we're working in and investing in are those of high integrity, are those that meet the integrity standards that have been set up by UNEP and other organizations. But in terms of, you know, the valuation beyond what are the standardized metrics, I think that's a larger question that we might not be able to fill into this time.
I'm just going to interrupt you just for one moment because I've been asked by 3 different people about coffee breaks. Fluids of a different nature. Just to interject to say there isn't one. However, if you very quietly need to be caffeinated, you can go outside, get some and bring it back into the room. I think you're allowed to bring it back in the room. I'm not sure about that. Not really. You can drink it quickly outside, then return to the room. And I'm sorry, Roman. I just wanted to say no coffee break, but just be discreet and don't miss the talks. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Lisa. We have maybe time for one more question. I think you were first. Do you wanna come in with a question? Okay, I see there are more. Let me try to accommodate more questions.
Thank you, Edwin Lau, Blue Dot Network. I think that your presentation had some really important insights for providing an evidence base for risk perception and trying to better inform the markets. But I wanted to ask about, from a public sector side, for governments or taking it back to the EIB, you know, MDBs that are looking to de-risk investments. Could there be some adverse impacts in terms of realizing that the cost of contingent liabilities are much higher when they make a loan guarantee?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a real risk, and unfortunately, there've been kind of differences in the way that people quantify that risk. And so I think that's something that we have to look out for in the coming years. And I don't think it's my role because I'm not an MDB to be able to see how they should handle that, but I do see that coming up as a question.
Okay, thank you. Can we pass on the mic to the gentleman in the middle of the row? Not sure how that's logistically possible, but maybe someone can pass it on. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. My name is Tim Zegboe from NWB Bank, and thank you very much for your presentation. And when I think about well, data finance can act upon, I'm really thinking about well, the cash flow stemming from a certain investment. And then I think one of the struggles is who's entitled to the cash flows and what are the cash flows. So especially if you look at adaptation measures, you have to, well, avoided cost. That's of course a cash flow, but it's not tangible. So do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, so I think you were saying cash flows?
I was talking about cash flows, yeah.
Okay, perfect. I think oftentimes I do think that there are a wider range of stakeholders that are entitled to different cash flows. But I think in most cases, we do leave that up to the national regulations associated with that. I'm not sure whether it's possible to have a more coherent or more standardized way to distribute these cash flows. And so for now, we leave it up to the national priorities, but then we try to inform those different regulations associated with that in the meantime, to ensure that it's equitable. But in terms of the different types of cash flows, it is often up to the national government, their regulation as well, associated.
Thank you for that question. Esther, I think we have more questions online.
Yes, it goes more or less in the same direction as the last one. It's from Álvaro from SECA, from Rumble, Danish Engineering and Design Consultancy. The question is, what do you think should be the top actions we can do to nudge the market in this context and reconcile the technical and financial perspectives in order to mature the market? So you mentioned regulations already, developing regulations. Any other actions that come to your mind?
Yeah, so I think it's a few things. First of all, I think it's a communication issue between technical people, financiers, between governments, etc. And so I think we need to co-develop a common language of how we speak about these things. But then beyond that, as you said, in terms of regulations, oftentimes the context that I work in have really complex regulations, some that are in conflict with each other within a singular country. And so I think there's an importance around streamlining those regulations and making them as easy to understand. And if, they might not be easy to understand, having that kind of engagement with stakeholders to ensure that they're able to understand these regulations. I think the next step would be really ensuring that when we're developing these things, that stakeholders are engaged and involved from the beginning, because it's very difficult to catch up if something has gone ahead without you being a part of this process. And so I think oftentimes we want to run full steam ahead, but there is a value in taking things a little bit slower to ensure that we have all the right stakeholders in the room at the same time who can bring their different types of expertise and competencies to it.
Thank you, Natalie. Those were really tough questions. You handled them really well. Let's give a round of applause to Natalie. So we'll move on to Simone. Simone, I think you'll be talking about how the blue economy is performing. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Thanks a lot. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simone Quattrini. I work for the European Commission Joint Research Center, as you were. And I'd like to offer a complementary perspective to the brilliant inputs that have been given by the previous speakers, namely about the climate impacts on the EU maritime economy. So this brief talk is essentially based on a service that the European Commission is providing since a few years. Some of you might know it is called EU Blue Economy Observatory, the objective of which is to monitor the evolution of the socio-economic performance of all blue economy sectors, and also keep track of some of the interesting market developments that affect the performance of these sectors. So allow me at the outset just to give a couple of definitions. First of all, by blue economy, for the purpose of this service, we mean all marine-based or marine-related economic activities that essentially use resources from the ocean, from the marine environment, or from coastal areas. So this encompasses a fairly wide range of sectors, industries, from fisheries and aquaculture to shipbuilding, and repair, port activities, maritime transport, both cargo and passengers, coastal tourism, the extraction of non-living resources from the marine environment, so oil, gas, salt, water itself from desalination technologies. And I would say also very importantly, ocean energy, so the offshore wind, but also some more emerging technologies, ocean wave and tidal energy. And what I mentioned so far are those sectors for which we are able to do this monitoring work thanks to EU-level comparable data that is originating from all the member states, and then it is integrated, assembled, and published by Eurostat. And together with that, at the Joint Research Center, we're also collecting, as part of the Common Fisheries Policy, data about fish catches and landings, and also fishing efforts, so essentially the fuel and carbon emissions by the fishing fleet and so on. So we are combining these data sets and produce information on a yearly basis that is disseminated through a EU Blue Economy report, and that is complemented by an online version through which we are making available these data sets through interactive dashboards that enable anyone to basically download data and do analysis and assessments as needed. Now, to give just a snapshot of the size of the blue economy in 2022, which is the last year for which we have data released by Eurostat, the EU blue economy represents a relatively small portion of the EU economy as a whole. In terms of gross value added, GVA, it is only 1.7% from our assessment, approximately 250 billion euros per year, and it employs nearly 4 million people, which is only 2.4% of EU employment as a whole. But these are relatively conservative figures because we are only covering through this analysis, again, those sectors for which we have comparable data. We are only covering the direct socioeconomic performance and not the indirect and induced one. So all the activities that these sectors generate across different value chains. And also, we are not able to include certain sectors for which we lack granular data to enable the distinction between the maritime proportion and the terrestrial proportion of certain industries. And so we know that these estimates are provide an underestimation of the actual size of the blue economy. On a more global scale, the OECD has estimated that the ocean economy, if it was a country, would be the 5th largest economy in the world. And so it is fairly important also, not only in terms of its contribution to our well-being, but also it's important to understand what are the impacts on these different sectors generated by exogenous shocks like climate change, but also other effects. For example, these two lines show the evolution of employment and GVA over the past 7-8 years. And you can see a major drop in 2020 due to essentially the COVID-19 pandemic. For the rest, what we know is that the blue economy is growing steadily, with one notable exception, which is non-living resources sector. And this is because, of course, the oil and gas industry in Europe is gradually decreasing, decommissioning oil and gas extraction platforms because of the ambitious decarbonization targets of the EU. In addition to that, another interesting fact is that we see consistently over time that coastal tourism is by far the most important sector across the blue economy, which employs nearly half, or actually more than half, of the total workforce of the blue economy in Europe, and more than 1/3 of the GDP, of the GVA, the gross value added of the blue economy. It is a sector that is particularly vulnerable to exogenous shocks like climate change, and is one that is therefore reacting more quickly compared to other sectors. In other words, it shrinks faster and it grows faster also in response to these shocks. One of the effects on coastal tourism, among others, is what was mentioned by several speakers before, which is the effect of climate change on coastal areas through coastal floodings, for example, and sea level rise. So we are monitoring these aspects as well from a socio-economic perspective in our report and observatory. And from our analysis, we understand that coastal flooding produces damages worth 1.2 billion euros per year, affecting approximately 72,000 people. We also know from our forecast analysis that these impacts are going to grow exponentially if coastal protection measures are not strengthened, enhanced over the next few years. Of course, estimates vary quite a lot according to the different, let's say, working assumptions, but the studies that we are monitoring show that these damages could grow between 100 and 800 times by the end of the century. Therefore, it's important to do something, it's important to take action. And in terms of, so the good news on that front is that the cost of action, so to speak, or the cost of doing adaptation against these risks are in the order of 1.1 to 1.8 billion per year in the EU, which therefore creates a fairly strong business case for such kind of interventions and investments. Now, more broadly, what we have observed is that over the past 23 years, since 2020 up to 2023, which is the latest year for which we have preliminary data from Eurostat, investments in the blue economy in Europe are growing steadily. And a good part of these investments are also fueled by the EU itself, with several funding organisms and programs, including EIB. And just to give an example, over the past 4 years, between 2020 and 2024, in the maritime transport sector alone, there was an investment from the EU, from different EU funding sources of approximately 1 billion euros over more than 150 projects that have enabled the industry to develop alternative fuels, more efficient vessel designs, propulsion systems, digitalization as well. Another example is in port activities. So because of the European Green Deal and the decarbonization targets of the EU, 58 ports in 16 member states today are equipped with what is called OPS, onshore power supply infrastructure, which enable vessels to basically be connected to the electricity grid while they are at berth. And of course, this is going to grow over the next few years. I will stop giving all these figures and percentages. Perhaps over the next few slides, I will show that, basically the source where, if you're interested in getting more details, you can find it. This is the 2025 edition of the Blue Economy Report, which carries, a foreword, for example, of the EU Commissioner for Startup Research and innovation, again, underlining the importance of innovation funding. And this is one of a series of reports that we are publishing since 2018. In addition to that, since 2022, there is an online version, as I was mentioning earlier, from where you can access interactive dashboards and databases. We are also quite proud of the input and collaboration that we are obtaining from a steering committee consisting of many directorate generals of the European Commission, 16 to date. The EIB is part of it, as well as other EU executive agencies. So the collaboration is increasing, which also enables us to bridge the data gap that we are still suffering, as I was mentioning at the introduction. If you are interested to go to the observatory and get this information about especially the climate impact or the energy transition targets and progress made, particularly in the maritime shipping sector and in the fishing sector, there is an energy transition section on the website. And I think this is my last slide with the necessary credits to the large number of people and colleagues that are contributing to this effort. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Simone. Another very important report. I wonder, in the audience, any questions on what we just heard? Anybody? There we are. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Kostas Delis from the Athens University of Economics and Business. Just curious to ask, how does the maritime sector respond to the growing needs for transition in the phasing of the ETS standards being more strict come 2026, so increased costs? Do you see any complementarities or risks for the sector?
Thanks a lot. Very good question. In fact, it is what we consider a success story. The ETS has been, a couple of years ago, expanded to the maritime sector as well, which has enabled a massive increase in investments in the maritime shipping industry and also in the industry along its supply chain to develop alternative fuels and to bring these new technologies to full fruition through the different process. It is a success story in that also it was a sector that was experiencing a relatively steady performance over the years, and this performance over the past 2 years is improving a lot. Also, thanks, I have to say, to the impacts of different other exogenous shocks, such as the pandemic, but also the disruption in trade routes and other conflicts, which have led to a growing distance that these vessels have to travel, and also has led to the ordering of bigger and bigger ships and vessels that are now being in the order book. It has to be said that from a European perspective, we are not benefiting so much from these trends. China is the biggest manufacturer of these large and very large ships. However, in some segments, such as cruise ships, Europe is still on the lead.
Esther, I think we have a question online.
Yes, very quickly, one question from Bergie Bilacht from the city of Ostende in Belgium. He's a little bit confused about the definition of blue economy because you have made reference to the oil and gas platforms. are they included in the definition of blue economy also of the European Commission? Thank you.
The answer is yes. However, I do really understand the confusion that this can generate, because originally the term blue economy, if I'm not mistaken, comes from World Bank and other organizations that had the strong sustainability connotation behind it. And so for the purpose of the EU Blue Economy Observatory, the perspective is to cover all maritime and coastal industries. Indirectly, we also observe, of course, the transition towards more sustainable practices, and the European Commission itself issued a communication in 2021 for promoting the transition of all EU industry towards more sustainability. And this is why it is important to also monitor the oil and gas industry, and also the effort it is making to identify additional or complementary business streams in order to comply with the decarbonization process and identify new business opportunities.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I already also had a pause when you mentioned that for the EIB, blue economy would also not be compatible with oil and gas. Do we have more? I see we have more questions. I need to be a bit more disciplined with the time now, so maybe we'll take one more question from the audience. Thorsten, if you don't mind?
Hi, I'm Ben. I write for Proximo, project finance and development finance specialist publication. Basically, I wanted to look at the issue through the sort of lens that Natalie laid out. I mean, what's the biggest challenge that you guys have found thus far in making the data that you've collected actionable? Thanks.
Thank you. One thing that comes immediately to mind, also by looking at the charts that I was showing, is the fact that we are forced to work with data that is 2 to 3 years old, which means that, of course, the signal that you can get from the analysis of this data suffers from this time lag, especially if it is oriented towards some investment decisions that need to be taken in the immediate term, be it from the public or the private sector. So the issue of time lag is something that is, of course, limiting the value of this information. Having said that, of course, it is important to also keep an eye on the evolution of the performance of these sectors, to be able to understand how, over historical data, historical time series, sectors have performed in presence of certain shocks or certain long-term impacts, such as climate change, for example. Because this also provides some interesting and useful indications about decisions that need to be taken about the future. But of course, I would say that is the main challenge. The justification of that is, of course, that data that we are working with are coming from member states, need to be integrated and aggregated and cleaned up, let's say, at the European level, which explains a bit the time that is required by the different instances involved in this process between the time they receive the data and the time that they can release it with a certain assurance that the data is of a certain quality.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have no more time for additional questions, but I want to thank you, Simone, for this super interesting input, and please give a round of applause to Simone. Thank you so much. Now we have 10 minutes approximately for Nicolas. And Nicolas, you'll be talking about where all of this data comes from and how we process it, right? A lot of these steps would probably sound familiar for the work that is behind what we heard from the other panelists today. So I think it was a really important contribution to, tell the audience a bit about how data is processed for these type of works. Thank you.
So hello back, everyone. You've seen very great, qualitatively presentations, also very beautiful presentations. I'm going to bring you back to my ugly slides, but hey, you can't have it all. So okay, so the objective today is to start from the fact that there is indeed a major gap between Google Scholar and the private markets. And at EDHEC Climate Institute, we are trying to bring in some of the scientific materials published in scientific journals into the private markets using EDHEC-made ventures. Today, the whole goal of this data in action is to show you in 10 minutes, it will be challenging, but we're going to do it, how to basically use existing freely available data and project subnationally the production impacts of climate change over time and over space. The idea of doing that will be to basically, so as usual, there is always a lot of things written on my slides because I was used to the fact that with my French accent, people used to not understand me. Now I realize that there are going to be a lot of things written, but listen to me, I think it's more important. Okay, let's go. Okay, there is something in the conversion. That's fine. So there are 4 steps. And in these 4 steps, if you follow me, in 10 minutes, I will try to tell you and to show you how to basically start from historical climate informations and link it all the way to the distribution of projected climate change impacts on economic production regionally. Okay? So we have 4 different steps, and we are going to start with the first one. Again, this is a local case study that is actually global coverage. So if you were ever interested in doing something more local, it would be quicker and easier. Okay? But I wanted to show you global so that you have an idea of what's going on. Okay, first step, very quick. We need to understand the relationship between temperature and economic production. The best way to do it is generally to look at historical information. There are very smart people that do it without using historical data. I'm not part of them. So basically what we do is that we process for most regions on Earth the historical distribution of temperature and precipitation over 50 years. What do? Basically, we link for each subnational region, Rhône-Alpes, Provence-Alpes, Côte d'Azur, for where we currently are, and we are trying to link the historical distribution of climate information, okay? To do that, we do basically some aggregation, some collapsing, but basically what we want to end up with is a sort of data sets, and for every year for which I have information about the economic production of this region, I can link the distribution of temperature and precipitation. And then going forward, basically, we can estimate a relationship. This relationship beyond all of the acronyms that are conventionally used, basically the idea is to identify a sort of relationship that explains if I have a 1% change in average temperature in this specific area, what is the likely response of output per capita? Doing that allows us to structure a relationship using real historical data spanning the last 50 years. Now that I have calibrated a function, I can now go and basically exploit this relationship to run my projections. Again, forget about the fixed effect and all of these. The main goal of doing that is to say, if I want to understand the projected future impacts on economic production from climate change, I need to know first what is the current relationship between temperature and output. And so a way to do that is basically to go get some simulations of climate change. So in today's specific case study, what we focus on is temperature. What we can do is basically Go on NASA's website. Again, this is a global case study. So if you were interested in a local area, it will take even less time. And we can basically process climate change simulation, what that is. Some people have been able to downscale over time and space local simulations of temperature daily up until 2100 by global climate model and by climate scenario. Doing that is very important because basically we will be able to link and combine together future simulations of temperature, our temperature delta, locally, with our function, our relationship of temperature and output. Doing that allows us to basically, so we can process, so that's a picture of this form of supercomputer that store and generate them, but basically the idea is that you have for this map 250,000 unique locations for which you have a time series of daily information on future climate conditions. So doing that basically allows us to basically decompose the impacts. And I've put a little square around the coastal area, but it was just a way to show you that we can actually work globally. And so the idea is that for each specific administrative region, you can have an ensemble of 1,000 or 2,000 unique simulations of future impacts. Because we have a lot of simulation, we can have a sort of confidence interval. And taking the median of this interval allows us to start working with uncertainty. And so basically the main idea of doing that is that then you can have basically for each region, for each climate scenario, for each global climate model, based on the model you're using, whether you're accounting for short-run, long-term effect, you can end up with some province-level projection of climatically driven impacts on economic production. And something of interest in that case is that you can start from gridded historical information and go all the way to damages. Again, let's go back to the integrated assessment model. The NGFS climate scenario, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, or the Oxford economic scenario are using these sort of damage functions to integrate physical damages into their modeling. And so it's very important to actually use granular data to calibrate this function adequately. Okay? And this is it. So this is a final word. So I can answer a question about it. So basically, the shaded area allows us to feature uncertainty. And the concept of uncertainty, I think, in climate change simulation is very important because there are multiple trajectories we are accounting for. There is some work we're doing in the Institute about probabilistic scenario. And basically, the idea is to try to have a sort of distribution for which we think the likely damages are going to be. Okay? So in terms of the final word, I'm going to bring up my three main questions that I've said at the beginning. And it is to basically, once again, use existing information, combine it with the right model, being able to answer the three questions, particularly about how much it will cost and who will pay for it. And this is, again, one good move forward towards understanding the heterogeneous adaptation investments of sectors. Another last thing, I think, before we keep going, will be that I had an old mentor that used to tell me that when you're doing this kind of modeling, assume that God is not with us, which means that it's very hard. Today, we have new methodology that allow us to basically simplify a lot of these models. And that's, I guess, a good way forward to bring in more information. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolas. I have 1 minute to thank the panel and wrap up the session. So I want to start. Thank you to Nicolas for all your inputs, and thank you for, as a highlight, mentioning the uncertainty element in your quite advanced modeling. We had no time to dive deeper, but that would have been really interesting. But thanks for showing us what's possible. Thank you to Simone for your report. A highlight for me was the high amount of investment needs for the rest of the century. We didn't have time to talk about why that isn't addressed already, but maybe we can do this later. But thank you for sharing this very important report. And Natalie, thank you so much. My favorite slide definitely was your dictionary between finances, bankers, and scientists. That's really stuck to my mind. And Thorsten, thank you so much for showing your report to us. What struck me was the amount of adaptation plans in coastal areas that don't take sea level rise into account. I think I'm going to do some digging on where this is and how it's possible. And thank you so much for the report. Please give a big round of applause to the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to Roman. And yes, I'm sorry to be a bugbear on timing, but it's only because I know some of you have a visit this afternoon, later this evening. And of course, all of the questions that were not asked, I know there was a few from earlier, they can be discussed over a cocktail tonight. You see, you've left it to the best place to discuss. So, without further ado, and I know Augusto had a question as well, so you can ask that question as well, Augusto, later on this evening. I want to introduce our next session. We are very lucky to have another wonderful panel of speakers, and it will be led by... I'll allow things to settle down a moment or two, and then I will introduce the panel because they're so great and I want you to absolutely know their names. We will have the next panel picture up. When I say we're going to have Marta Vicarelli, who is Assistant Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. She has come via Boston, via Milan, her home, to us here in Nice. And she is going to showcase her work on climate adaptation planning and programming for coastal resilience. And then her panel will be Eduardo Carlucci, Policy Advisor for Sustainable Finance at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. So Eduardo, welcome. We also have, we've heard from him already, Michael Back, who is a Senior Adaptation Analyst, Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI. Welcome, Michael, again. We have Massimo Mara, Lead Networking Platform Coordinator for Jaspers at the European Investment Bank, and also Stephen Hart, Finance Advisor for Operations Advisory Services at the EIB also. So welcome, and Marta, I hand over to you.
I believe somebody might have forgotten their notebook. I'm going to leave it here. Sorry. You're welcome. Welcome, everybody. So good afternoon, and thank you to EIB for inviting me. I'm really delighted to chair this session. We will explore climate adaptation planning and programming for coastal resilience. We will hear from an outstanding panel of speakers with very diverse expertise, and they will provide practical insights into climate adaptation and resilience. We would like to make this session as engaging and interactive as possible, and so we would like to ask you from the start to start thinking about key takeaways and actions or action steps that you would like to recommend as we return to our work on coastal adaptation. We will ask this question at the end, and we would really like to hear your thoughts in terms of what are steps that we can take to accelerate transformative adaptation planning. Our section today will be structured as follows. We're going to have 3 short presentations, the first by me, and then Eduardo and Michael. We will then have a little break for Q&A from you, and then we will follow with the contributions and reflections from Massimo and Stephen. And then we're going to have another round of Q&A and questions and reflections. So thank you for setting up the slides for me. I would like to, my presentation is going to try to highlight barriers and enabling factors. Let me just check how to transition. Great. I would like to highlight barriers and enabling factors for the adoption of climate adaptation strategies. And I would like to bring us to the local level, municipal level and planning agencies. And then we will focus for a little bit on nature-based solutions and the scientific evidence that we have on the effectiveness and cost-effectiveness of nature-based solutions, which is my area of expertise. So, first of all, in terms of barriers and enabling factors, there are several areas recognized by different institutions, and there are three specific pillars that I think are very important: resources, coordination and governance, and data and information. So what I'm going to do now is to bring you with me to the US for a second and share some insights from a survey study, actually multiple survey studies, that we performed in Massachusetts in partnership with the Massachusetts Municipal Association and several universities, also in Costa Rica, the United Nations University in Germany, and University of Glasgow. We have developed multiple survey studies in trying to understand resilience strategies, but in general, resilience outlook for Massachusetts municipalities. What are the challenges, the plans, and the needs? When we asked about barriers, we found that, and probably you're going to identify these barriers based on your experience as well. When we asked about barriers to municipalities, the barriers that they most frequently reported, and in this graph you see two colors, dark blue for towns and light blue or teal for cities. The barriers most frequently reported include lack of municipal staffing capacity to dedicate to climate-related issues, and also no centralized way to identify funding sources, and lack of grant writing capacity. This lack of grant writing capacity may be very specific to the US because there is a very special financing strategy for adaptation planning, but this appears to be a concern in other parts of the world as well. When we think about coordination and governance, so barriers are the other side of enabling factors. The barriers reported most frequently by our towns and cities are insufficient resources to mobilize broad community support and difficulties changing regulations and bylaws in these communities. You will also see here difficulty identifying and prioritizing specific action steps within the municipality. I will go back to this type of challenge because it's strongly related with knowledge and technical skills. I would also like to highlight this need for more regional cooperation and need for more unified and coordinated efforts within the municipality itself. Essentially, when we interviewed somebody from the Department of Public Works, they told us we are not necessarily working in sync with the Department of Sustainability or with other units within the municipality. So essentially, there is a coordination effort that is also part of the challenge. Now, when we go to data, this is our bridge to the previous section. When we think about data, the biggest challenges encountered are a series of lack of technical expertise challenges. And I'm going to list them for you. The lack of expertise to assess fiscal and economic impacts, but also to manage natural resources, to manage also climate change hazards and impacts, and then lack of technical expertise in engineering and on-the-ground projects. So we see that there is a sort of workforce gap that is emerging from this type of answers. We also see that there is a challenge related to metrics to assess progress. So monitoring and assessment of progress emerges challenges for our local communities. Down here, I have highlighted in yellow insufficient high-resolution local data. And when we asked municipalities what is the data most urgently needed, they reported, to accelerate resilience planning, they reported we need more high-resolution data on economic impacts of local climate change. Who can provide this data? So we had a lot of discussions in the previous section about first of all, optimism about the large availability of data, but also how do we transfer this data? Natalie was bringing up this point. How do we translate this data for communities to be able to use this data? So I wanted to bring some good news in terms of initiatives that we have seen developing. The city of Boston has recently received a $10 million grant from NOAA to develop a green workforce platform, essentially to create new professions for the future of the region. And some of these professions are specifically to implement nature-based solutions, so design, planning, and implementation of nature-based solutions. These are not just jobs, these are professions that the area, so the city of Boston, wants to create. And what I really like about this is that in order to develop this initiative, they reached out to many different stakeholders from underserved communities and also universities, for example, my case. And the purpose of this is to really create an informed workforce development effort. Despite the challenges, something that stood out in Massachusetts is this great desire to implement nature-based solutions. And in this slide, dark blue means that that nature-based solution has already been implemented, pink means that there is interest, and teal means that there is no interest. And you can see that there is more than 80% of municipalities have already adopted nature-based interventions, from nature-based solutions to mitigate and prevent erosion, to prevent flooding, to improve stormwater management, to reduce heat island effects. What do we know about nature-based solutions? Some of you might have heard of the United Nations Environment Assembly resolution, the definition adopted. I just put it here not to be pedantic, but really to think for a second about this definition. These nature-based solutions can be really thought as actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use and manage what? Many different types of ecosystems. So natural, modified, terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, marine ecosystems. And the part that is crucial in this effort is that we are trying to address several challenges, social, economic, and environmental, in order to provide simultaneously multiple benefits: human well-being, ecosystem services, resilience, biodiversity benefits. This has been recognized also by the European Environmental Agency. In the recent publication, Scaling Up Nature-Based Solutions, the EEA highlighted the strategic importance of NBS for the European Union policy, from the European Green Deal, the EU Biodiversity Strategy, and the EU Adaptation Strategy. And always, nature-based solutions are presented as a win-win action approach to mitigate, to adapt to climate, to mitigate climate, to enhance biodiversity, and improve human well-being. So what do we know about effectiveness, and what do we know about cost-effectiveness scientifically? What's the big challenge in trying to answer this question? That nature-based solutions incorporate multiple dimensions, and so evidence is scattered across the literature. So it's really challenging to collect evidence across different publications, from physical, natural, and social sciences, for example. However, the good news is that literature has increased over time, and I'm talking of peer-reviewed studies. This time series shows the evolution of publications on nature-based solutions, and what is really interesting is that besides the growing trend, you also see upticks in correspondence to important international climate change policy initiatives. The IPCC Special Report on Extreme Events, the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, COP21, the Paris Agreement, and then more recently the European Green Deal. All this data on nature-based solutions was channeled to create reviews of peer-reviewed studies. And so we have two examples here. The first study is a study by a group from Oxford University that mapped the effectiveness of nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. And the result was that nature-based solutions are indeed effective in adapting to climate change. And then on the right-hand side, you see another study, a 2021 study, collecting scientific evidence for ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. So are nature-based solutions helpful in mitigating disaster risk? The answer was yes, again. I also wanted to highlight something, because in our discussion about data, one challenge is the translation of this data, but one challenge is also to make sure that scientists from different disciplines talk to each other. And so you see the list of authors in this publication. There's a lot of authors, and they're all from different disciplines. I also appear down here, and we are all in alphabetical order, because everybody from different disciplines contributed to this huge effort. It was almost 6 years of work. So thanks to this growth in evidence, we observed a growth in support for nature-based solutions, and they have been recognized in international framework agreement and regional and national policies. From the UN Biodiversity Conference, European Green Deal, the World Bank has an entire group working on nature-based solutions, and also the White House previous administration produced a roadmap, a very significant document to accelerate opportunities to develop nature-based solutions. And I wanted to mention, and I provide a QR code, a potentially helpful product from the efforts of the White House. I contributed to this report, and this report attempts to evaluate the effectiveness of 23 nature-based solutions to reduce risk, and provides recommendations to implementing and designing nature-based solutions. So are MBS cost-effective? You may wonder. It's really important. Should we invest? Could investors be interested in this type of strategy? So towards the wrapping up of my presentation, we analyzed nature-based solutions literature, peer-reviewed literature, from 2000 to 2021. And we consider only publications that evaluate the economic effectiveness of nature-based solutions. And this map shows the distributions, the dots correspond to the distribution of the observations in the studies in our database. Yellow dot indicates studies that found that nature-based solutions are cost-effective, and blue dots indicate studies that found that nature-based solutions are cost-effective under certain circumstances. No study found that nature-based solutions are systematically not cost-effective. In a different graphical form, essentially 71% of studies found that nature-based solutions are always cost-effective. We also we checked in the studies in our database which studies performed a comparison between nature-based solutions and engineering strategies. 39% of articles in the database performed this comparison, and 65% concluded that nature-based solutions are systematically more cost-effective than engineering-based strategies, and 26% of studies found that nature-based solutions are more cost-effective than engineering-based strategies under certain circumstances. No study found that engineering-based strategies, and I'm referring to purely engineered strategies with no hybrid component, no study found that purely engineered-based strategies are more cost-effective. Are you surprised? We were not, because when you think about nature-based solutions, they bring a lot of benefits. Previous presentations refer to ecosystem services. So we have many services, protective services, besides the ones we already mentioned, flood protection, landslide protection, avalanche protection, but also other regulating services, carbon capture and sequestration, pollution mitigation, heat mitigation, water quality improvements. And then we have provisioning services that often are associated with proper markets, and so they're easier to estimate and calculate: provisioning of food, free water, livestock fodder, fuel wood, genetic resources. And lastly, sometimes harder to estimate, cultural services, opportunities for recreation and ecotourism, spiritual and religious benefits. We don't have markets for spiritual and religious benefits, but they are still economic values, and environmental economists attempt to estimate them and include them in assessment of benefits. So actually, the problem, however, is that they are hard to estimate. So what we found is that benefits are often understudied, and when they are studied, they are usually underestimated for lack of data or lack of resources to perform the evaluation itself. Last observation, and this is going to be a key component in our discussion later, What about the financing of these interventions? In this graph, you see on the left-hand side property rights, on the right-hand side sources of finance. What do we mean in economics when we talk about property rights? We mean who manages the resource. So who manages these nature-based solutions? In this graph, dark blue means public, teal means private, yellow means mixed. So who dominates? Which color dominates the property rights side? Mixed. So the management of the resources is a mix between public and private. But what about the sources of finance? It's predominantly blue. So it's public sector that's primarily financing nature-based solutions. Are we happy with that? Probably not, because probably we need also private capital to really accelerate the adoptions of these interventions towards really transformative expansion and upscaling. How do we achieve that? Strengthening evaluation methods to really assess cost and benefits of nature-based solutions may really pave the way for additional funding and financing options for innovative financing strategies. So something that has, in conclusion, something that has emerged also in publications from the European Union is this need for monitoring and impacts, better monitoring and impacts, improvement of indicators, and development of standardized metrics. We are sometimes a little bit distressed about we don't have maybe enough good standardized metrics for nature-based solutions. Last night over dinner, we actually brainstormed a little bit about this. And after speaking with my wonderful panelists, I added just a few screenshots. There are efforts out there. And for example, the US Army Corps of Engineers, which is the engineering branch of the US Army, has developed these phenomenal initiatives, which is engineering with nature, where this is precisely what's happening. There is development of methods and standards to improve assessments, also of benefits and cost, to improve monitoring performance and outcomes by integrating also people and policy in the design. And the idea is really to integrate engineering efforts and nature considerations in design of nature-based solutions and hybrid infrastructure. This is just a screenshot of some of the products that you may see there. These slides are going to be available, and I tried to add QR codes so that you can access these resources if you're curious. The effort of our session is really to give you as many inputs and opportunities as possible in case they are helpful moving forward. But by just looking at the titles, you see that it's very exciting. Infrastructure simulator to quantify benefits, reproducible framework, standardized methods to score resilience-focused outcomes, and then ecosystem and flood risk management compatibility investigation, compatibility between engineering and nature-based solutions. This is the final slide, and I want to mention that the European Union is already doing really great work in terms of innovative financing strategies. This is a project financed by the European Union. It's the Naturance project that tries to integrate the outlook of the insurance sector with nature-based solutions. And essentially, you see in the subtitle, Nature for Insurance and Insurance for Nature, the goal of the project is to develop innovative financing strategies in partnership with the insurance sector. This is a consortium of universities, including University of Venice, Cambridge University, LSE, and numerous other universities. And in the consortium, in the research consortium, which is unique, there are reinsurance companies and insurance companies to try to develop these new instruments. I think insurance was mentioned before, and so we're already on it, and this is an additional resource. This is a QR code in case you want to download more resources, and I put them all on my webpage. I took a bit of time, but I hope this was an interesting overview to set the ground for future discussion. And now I'm going to leave the floor to Eduardo. Thank you, Eduardo.
Hello, everyone. I'm Eduardo Carlucci. I'm Sustainable Finance Advisor at IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We are an international think tank. So I'm going to present today our methodology to assess the impact of nature-based infrastructure. Before, I would like to introduce the terminology of nature-based infrastructure because generally it gets confused with a nature-based solution. So basically, the broader terminology includes infrastructure, where within we have the cluster of sustainable infrastructure for minimizing the environmental impacts. And nature-based infrastructure is a cluster in between sustainable infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So why I'm talking about nature-based infrastructure? Because we apply our methodology to assess the co-benefits of these type of projects of nature-based infrastructure. And generally, we compare the built or gray infrastructure with the nature-based infrastructure, and we see the different impacts. For example, in the case of flood protection, we can use a drainage system as a gray infrastructure or a wetland for nature-based infrastructure. But restoring a wetland in flood-prone areas can reduce flood risk, but also providing co-benefits, several co-benefits, from providing improved water quality, habitats for wildlife, or supporting local recreation, which is not the case for the drainage system or the built infrastructure, which can provide an immediate risk, can address the immediate risk, but not providing the same co-benefits as the natural-based infrastructure. So basically, we see natural-based infrastructure as a system or an area that harnesses nature to provide infrastructure services for people, the economy, and the environment. And these also include ecosystems such forest, mangroves, wetlands, and grasslands, but also hybrid infrastructures. So basically combining engineered or gray infrastructure with nature-based solutions like rain gardens, green roofs, or sustainable urban drainage systems. So going a little bit more on the methodology that we use, we divide our methodology in different steps. The first one is the qualitative analysis using system mapping. So through the co-creation of a causal loop diagram with the stakeholders, with local stakeholders. And then we apply the quantitative analysis. From there, we use system dynamic models where we integrate local specific data, spatial analysis, climate data, and the results is an integrated cost-benefit analysis that is going to consider 3 dimensions, the social, environmental, and economic dimension. So the idea is to go from a qualitative to a quantitative type of analysis where we use system mapping to provide a qualitative storytelling that is going to inform the decision-making process. So it's through the stakeholder engagement process, which is a very important step, that we identify the indicators that we are going to apply or to integrate in the simulation models. So the simulation models enrich the storytelling even more by bringing figures to the analysis. And this is a way also to try to convince certain stakeholders to uptake the project. So basically, from system thinking or system mapping, we identify the indicators, which can include tangible and intangible benefits. We cover, as I was saying before, the environmental, social, and economic dimensions. We integrate both the positive and negative externalities, and we establish a timeline for the project. Also defining the scenarios, it's another important aspect that we assess in the quantitative analysis, and basically we define the baseline, so the status quo and the MBS scenarios, or the MBI scenarios, and we include also a scenario with a gray infrastructure for comparison. So we compare how the impact of the gray infrastructure will perform against the MBS. We also perform sensitivity analysis, and then we consider the financial and economic CBA. To make a distinction between economic and financial analysis, that's a very important aspect because there are different methodologies, different way to approach it, and it's important to have an integrated approach to both, to the economic and the financial. So basically, the economic analysis evaluates the broader societal value of the project by including also the externalities. It considers the shadow prices instead of the market prices to account the externalities, and also reflect the project contribution from a societal welfare point of view. On the other side, the financial analysis, it's assess the project from a perspective of the investment for the sponsors. It identifies the revenues over the project lifetime. But also, what is really important here is that to go beyond the traditional financial assessments, especially for MBS and natural-based infrastructure projects, where actually we can try to convert those benefits assessed in the economic analysis as revenue streams. Try to understand how to convert them to create revenue streams to fund the project. So I'm going to show you now a quick video on system mapping on how the creation of the causal loop diagram that we do with the stakeholders, with the local stakeholders. For some reasons, it's not working. No. Okay, it's not. Okay, I can't click on the video, but anyway. What I'm going to present is going to be a quick case study where we basically assess the value of the benefits for coastal protection in the Netherlands, more specifically in the Ansbos and Pettemer sea dunes. I'm sorry for my very poor Dutch pronunciation. But basically, we went through the creation of the causal loop diagram with the stakeholders to understand the environmental risk, the social risk, and the economic risk linked to sea level rise and environmental risk in the area. And we produce an integrated cost-benefit analysis. One of the key performance indicators that we look at is the net present value. And in this case, we observed that if we compare a natural-based solution like dunes, the creation of dunes, against the grey infrastructure, so the sea, for example, seawalls, we see that the net present value is always positive for the nature-based solutions across the 4 scenarios in case of no floods events or in case of additional floods events occurring across the 50 years. On the contrary, the grey infrastructure, it's negative for the scenarios with 0 floods event happening or 1 flood event. So this showed the economic viability of the project, even if there are no floods events happening. We are working on several studies, also on coastal protection, including the one is in South Africa, another one in Senegal, and another one in Italy. Now we are working on another project in Senegal for mangroves restoration in the delta of Sine Saloon and Casamance, and the project is called Naturel. We have methods for integrated assessments of natural-based solutions. So it's a guideline that we produce for the European Investment Bank and public authorities, and it provides detailed instructions at every stage of the assessment process, from identifying the benefits of the MBS to exploring different financing solutions and how to communicate them across different stakeholders. The different steps includes the system thinking, system mapping, as I was telling you before. So the step where we talk with the local stakeholders, with the local communities, with the indigenous people to get the local knowledge that is going to be integrated into our models. We identify the costs and the benefits. We integrate climate data, and then we quantify the cost and the benefit. So we monetize the cost and the benefits that are enabling the practitioner to translate into diverse outcomes or into economic terms. Then we establish financing options. So we explore potential financing options, especially considering the local environment and different strategies that can work for the project. Then the last step, which is very important as well, is to tailor the insights for various stakeholders. So basically, we we basically try to address the outcomes according to different stakeholders that we are talking with. There are additional readings, if you are interested, I can share. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you. And give the floor to Michael.
Thank you. Straight over. This is a bit of a marathon, so thanks everyone for bearing with us. Let me start by asking everyone, or inviting everyone, to stand up for a moment and take a stretch. I don't know if anyone's ever had the pleasure of a trip to South Korea, but on Asiana Airlines, they force everyone, they change off your video and force everyone to stretch for a minute. So yeah. Okay, what are we doing? Arrows? Oh, and hi everyone. My name's Michael Back. I work with the Global Green Growth Institute. We're an international organization based in South Korea. I am a senior analyst working on adaptation resilience and leading a community of practice in Folu. All of that's in the title somehow. So I'm here kind of to provide some examples from outside of the EU. As at the GGI, I will be frank, we do not work very much in the EU. So I'll try to go through some of the work that we do in adaptation planning and give a quick introduction to GGI for those who aren't familiar, and then use an example from Indonesia, which I think is probably our best country example of moving from adaptation planning into the implementation of nature-based solutions with the goal of scaling finance for nature-based solutions. I'm very grateful to my, and bonus round if we have time, into sustainable finance. I'm very grateful for the previous panelists for defining nature-based solutions and proving to you all that this is important. I actually really wanted to put a slide like on top of Eduardo's slide, kind of looking at NBS infrastructure, and then you can put some more Venn diagrams on top of that with like ecosystem-based adaptations. We love definitions and acronyms in this industry. So, GGI, we are an intergovernmental institution. We are headquartered in South Korea, and we are quite young. It's a 12-year-old institution. We are member country based, and the operation of our model is really to support member countries in implementing green growth priorities. A lot of that is around NDCs and climate change objectives. And we have, while our headquarters is in Seoul, we have operations in almost all of the countries that we work in, so we work very much on the ground in country, usually sitting directly in a Ministry of Climate Change or Environment. We work across a large number of themes, but I'll focus really on GGI's work in adaptation and resilience, and also how kind of talking about what we call our value chain. And over the course of the presentation, I'll try to move from the high-end global vision of our value chain down to the implementation of projects and opportunities. So we work with member countries, and again, everything is member country driven, everything is kind of in partnership with ministries and with stakeholders. We work with member countries on NDCs, planning and enhancing nationally determined contributions, as well as other UNFCCC mechanisms, such as NAPs, LT-LEDs, and then subnational plans. We work with suites of analytical tools, maybe not always as advanced as what we've been presented already, but we're really excited to learn from the kinds of economic tools and NBS tools that we see. And then we try to apply those to design and pilot different investments, in particular in nature-based solutions and adaptation, and then working both at the regional and national level. I sit at kind of a bit of a global practice in order to support the innovative design of projects and projects that are ultimately investable and scalable. And then finally, on the right side of our value chain, we talk about sustainable finance. We support member countries in issuing blue and green bonds, debt for nature swaps, and other access to finance that enables all of the lovely things that we're trying to do. In terms of the NDC enhancement program in particular, so this is a global program where we work with member countries to enhance NDCs. This is a bit of an old slide, but just to give you an idea of scale, this is across 28. I think we're working on 15 national adaptation plans globally as well. We really do try to start at the global level with these kinds of UNFCCC mechanisms. Great. And then I'll zoom in, and it was really hard to pick a case study. There's also some really awesome work that GGI is doing in the Pacific that I wanted to highlight, but I wanted to flag just our work in Indonesia, as I think it's probably the best example of moving from the adaptation planning into the investments themselves. Why this matters: in Indonesia, 75% of the territory is maritime. Indonesia represents 17% of the world's blue carbon, seagrass and mangroves. And again, I'll talk a lot about blue carbon in this presentation and using that as a mechanism for nature-based solutions, nature investments that thankfully we have already proven are valuable from an adaptation and disaster risk reduction perspective. So I won't go into all of this as it's a bit complicated, but this is just a sense of kind of over the last 10 years what GGI's Indonesia office has worked on together with the government. Starting at the left side, a lot of RED Plus projects, a lot of support for carbon implementation, and then getting that into their NDC and roadmap through various iterations of the updated NDCs, and then ultimately with the goal of driving investment in forestry and carbon spaces. And then moving to more recently, GGI hosts a carbon transaction facility where we support ITMOs, direct carbon trades under Article 6. I am told by our carbon team to be very specific that those are not land-based at this point because that is hard, nor are they blue carbon, but we work with member countries to try and promote blue carbon trades and to move closer to that being a reality. And then what we see in this office a lot now is kind of this enabling environment for blue carbon happening alongside and implementing the NDC and getting that blue carbon into the NDC, and then at kind of the subnational, the local scale, the implementation of projects. Actually, this is together with Wetlands International for mangrove restoration and kind of making economic models for nature-based solutions. So again, coming into the national level, one of the main things that our Indonesian country team is looking at is the MRV systems around blue carbon, and especially the design of MRV systems in seagrass environments. And so we're working on AI implementation, which, wow, this is only the second time AI has been said over the course of 3 hours. That's pretty crazy in 2025, just saying. So doing some kind of AI implementation to try and upgrade our MRV systems and get these MRV systems for both mapping blue carbon assets across Indonesia into the nationally determined contributions and into national policy. And then ultimately with the goal of that driving finance through blue carbon markets. So now I'll get into the actual investments in an actual project, because that's a bit of what I was asked to speak on. And one of my favorites that GGI is working on is the Nature-Based Solutions for Climate-Smart Livelihoods in Mangrove Landscapes, NASCLIN project. This is funded by the Canadian government and in partnership with Wetlands International. And really what is at the core of everything that the organization does is the economic element and assessing the economics of these projects, especially as it comes down to sustainable local livelihoods, right? Because as we look to kind of downscale from these infrastructural loans, large-scale investments, to the scale of the specific farmer, we really have to ask, what's the economic model at the local farmer, fisher folk level, right? So that's a lot of what the analysis is going into. And this is in Kalimantan. So now we are on the east coast of Kalimantan. This is actually quite close to where Nusantara, the new proposed capital, is, and this is something we work on a bit as well. And what we're looking at here is really the challenge around deforestation of mangrove areas. This is around Samarinda in the Markham Delta. Sorry for my pronunciation. And yeah, what we can see is a lot of deforestation, very much driven by aquaculture, clearing of mangrove forests for that. And so the model that we work on is called this, let me make sure I get it, the ecological mangrove rehabilitation model, which is basically most traditional mangrove rehabilitation is about planting, and we are much more focused on hydrologic conditions and ensuring that in these deforested areas, the hydrologic conditions are met to enable blue carbon mangroves to take root and recolonize areas. So what the team then looks at is they work in these deforested areas, especially in it's basically former shrimp and fish farms, and then do, as you see here, the actual excavation to create hydrologic conditions that enable mangrove restoration, and trying to get the cost of that down. The other side of this is the associated mangrove aquaculture piece, which is really just trying to take all of these lessons that we've learned about ecosystem services to say, in an area you can use the ecosystem, use the mangroves to do more efficient aquaculture. We can increase aquaculture productivity by basically separating the sides of our pond, doing restoration on one side, and doing our aquaculture in another area. Here's a bit of what this looks like in practice. And as I said, we have a couple offices across Kalimantan. We partner with Wetlands International as well as local NGOs and government in order to do that. And so this is actually an example from Myanmar, but I think it fits within the same case because we kind of haven't gotten to this part yet in the project in Indonesia. And really it's about making the point of blue carbon projects, blue carbon investments. That carbon is an asset, right, and is one part of the investment, but ultimately when we talk about blended finance, when we talk about these investments, we have to look at different elements, and something we promote a lot at GGI is putting the economics on the other industries, right? So looking at the benefit ratios for mud farming, mud crab farming, as well as fish farming, and really assessing what are the overall benefits that these blue carbon interventions can have, and providing both the economic and financial analysis that, as you get down to the local scale, really can be difficult to come by and lacking, and can be a big barrier to these projects actually happening in practice. And just some pictures about what this kind of look like, some of the different industries that GGI works with. And bonus round, if I have 30 seconds, last slide, is the sustainable finance. So could have done a whole separate presentation on this because I think it's really interesting, but then ultimately what GGI and what I think everyone in here is trying to do is scale finance towards towards nature-based investments. And so we recognize that these are not very bankable investments, and so on my left, the right side, TA resources, ODA resources, especially when we're working in LMIC countries, are very necessary as our costs of capital are high. And then this is kind of where we cut into a conversation of blended finance, which I'll leave for another time. But I think it's a really important conversation to have if we're going to aggregate and scale the kinds of blue carbon investments that we talked about today. Thanks.
Thank you. So for the sake of time, what I would suggest is we take 3 questions from the audience, and then we ask the questions. And after those 3 questions, we are going to transition to our next 2 speakers who are going to contribute a few reflections. And with the remaining time, we're going to have more question and answers. Are there questions from the audience? I see 1, 2. I can bring you mic.
Thank you. Jan Brook from Piank. One of the challenges we have with nature-based solutions, but I would argue not only with nature-based solutions, but also some of the more conventional solutions, is actually, this is a point I made earlier, it's actually about understanding whether or not they are delivering. Because part of scaling up is having the confidence that the solution is actually working. And I think this was discussed a little while ago. We also touched on this at a EC-EIB Adaptation Inland Transport meeting, is how do you, once you've got something in place, how do you motivate the organization that has benefited from that investment to actually monitor whether it's succeeding? It's very easy if it fails, because we understand that. But once something is in place and it's working, and you get a storm, and you don't get any damage because the mangroves are absorbing the storm or the classic breakwater is doing its job, there's a real difficulty in collecting and collating information to demonstrate what is the adaptation metric that is equivalent to reduced carbon emissions for mitigation. And I think for me this is a real issue when we're looking to scale up, is actually motivating organizations, and in UNEC we concluded that maybe academia has a role here, because the infrastructure operator, often has no interest as long as they're not experiencing these recurring events. So they have a storm, but they almost don't even notice it because the thing works. I'd wonder whether the panel have a view on that, maybe for nature-based solutions, but also any kind of adaptation.
Thank you very much. So we're going to pick up two more questions. These questions is what motivates monitoring and what is success in terms of adaptation? So what are the metrics? Please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, I'm replacing Esther and I'm moderating the questions from our online participants. So there is one question that goes in the same direction as the one raised by Jan. So again, from Hazem, from Allianz Economic Research. How much mangrove would reduce real asset damages share when a hurricane hit? So really exactly the same question as you asked. Another question to you, Marta. Are there studies about the added value of NBS when used as a complementary solution to infrastructure in emerging economies in particular? And a question for Eduardo regarding the Dutch case study that he presented. Did you account for the costs of establishing the nature infrastructure as well? I believe you only showed the benefits, but that's only half of the business case. Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody would like to answer the first question?
Okay, I'll take the first one. What incentivizes monitoring? I mean, the first answer is money. I think we have to pay for our monitoring systems, right? But then I think maybe the more important answer to that is how do we reduce the costs of monitoring? And how do we know what we're monitoring? And I would say there is a lot of work being done to establish effective MRV systems. I would point to the types of cost-benefit analysis. There's also something called the Eclipse project, which is an EU-wide project that creates a pretty big database of different ecosystem services. So I think these are great starting points, but yes, we need European Investment Bank and big investment players to come to decisions of what are the adaptation criteria we're talking about, and I think damages are a big piece of that. And then we need technologies, MRV technologies, GIS, that reduces the cost of doing that monitoring. And I think that's what, from maybe our previous session, is really exciting right now, is how much opportunity there is for those costs to come down in a way that I think makes this realistic.
Just a very quick addition. I think you're right. Academia has a role and it should play it. And I've seen it at least, I see it in the US, but I see it more and more in Europe. The fact that academia is stepping up, not only in trying to provide support in monitoring and evaluation, but also to provide literacy to communities to get to know better the risks and the possible solutions. Eduardo, and then we're going to transition to Massimo and Steve.
Yeah. So, it's true that the methodology that we apply, it's for pre-feasibility studies, so it doesn't go further than monitoring. I agree that the monitoring is an extremely important aspect, also to create the track record for nature-based solutions, which is extremely important today when we're talking about financing nature-based solutions against grey infrastructure, who has already a track record in place, but not for nature-based solutions or nature-based infrastructure. And maybe in terms of monitoring, what is important is also the governance structure. It's an important element that needs to go from all phases, all stages, from design to monitoring. And the financing part is extremely important also for the monitoring.
I just want to answer very briefly the question about added value and studies in emerging economies. There are many. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to be happy to share the data. And if you took a screenshot of my slides, I'm going to be able to post there also additional resources.
Thank you, Marta. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'll be brief so we can stay here until 6 now. Joking. First of all, just to introduce myself, Massimo Amara, working on the advisory service part of the EIB, particularly the technical advisory. This is a line of business that has grown substantially over the last 10 years. We provide technical and financial advisory, both inside and outside EU, to our counterparts in the context often of cooperations with European Commission services, other donors, including at the national level. In general, we provide various services. I will not bother you today with this, but feel free to visit the web pages you will see on the website. I just wanted to contribute a little bit of an experience, the experience on the ground, because in fact, as advisory service, we work quite a lot directly with those that actually have to prepare projects, implement them, and eventually decide and assess them. And I wanted to start, it's maybe a bit less technical. We had 2 very interesting masterclass, very technical. Thanks for the speakers also for this second masterclass. But I want to start by echoing what Natalie said in the previous panel, that we need to develop, and it's important, a common language on what is adaptation actually, why we want to do adaptation, perhaps change the narrative as well. I will just add 2 stakeholder groups to yours, not only scientists and financiers, but also the public authorities, and in particular the decision makers, and the general public. Because in fact, what we see is often, even if there is a very willing and illuminated authority with financing, in absence of buy-in from decision makers and the public, and the 2 are connected because of course it's a political process, things don't work very well. The corollary to this is adaptation is still pretty much unknown. People do not understand, or they have their own understanding of what adaptation means. And I think the process the Commission has started for the next period, financial period, of moving towards the thinking of preparedness and resilience to climate change is much clearer because in fact it's common sense. And even the layman and the laywoman can understand why. Yeah? Why this is important and why there is a need to act. But linked to this, as I said, very technical, the experience we have, nature-based solutions, and here we are in an expert group, are also even less understood. So it's important really to explain in communicable but also replicable terms what these solutions are, what the benefits, the co-benefits they can bring, and this eventually linked to what Jan, linked to monitoring. So what you get on top of a great solution when you do a nature-based solution. And here monetizing, quantifying the effects and monetize them and also communicate it in a clear narrative that can be understood by everybody, I think is very important. And indeed, Eduardo, this work is quite interesting. I'm an economist myself. The concept and the methodology can be applied when then taking into account investment and operating costs. Maintenance is also another important area because, okay, once we have done the investment, then somebody should keep it up. Yeah, otherwise, okay, I will not go into the issue of the word discussed yesterday evening about distributional effect, but this is also another quite substantial area. Another reflection is, while we establish all this, then the capacity is to plan, program, prepare projects and implement them at the local level in particular, but in some cases also national level. And here we're talking also all member states, not poor municipalities outside of the EU. It's very limited, and this is limited in terms of resources, knowledge, and money. So I think indeed we need to think of ways to cater for this. We try to do quite a lot in terms of building capacities. Quite interesting the example of the workforce in Boston. I think this is quite interesting to replicate, because it's a simple initiative that can be replicated. What else? It would simplify quite a lot if all these considerations are actually formalized in technical standards. Requirement for construction, so because we are actually asking a voluntary effort to designers, those project promoters, to do something that is actually, in a way, deviating from the norm. So if those things go into the norm, will make the life easier to everybody. And if you want to, will also force those that don't know, they haven't been converted yet, to do it in any case. And that will facilitate the implementation of resilience measures and nature-based solutions. How we know that in the EU, the standards are being updated. We've been discussing with DG Klima from the Commission, as Vanessa here, in which way are they taking into consideration future climate, and to what extent, and how do they cope with the uncertainty? Because also that's the thing, uncertainty means more money if you want to be more protected, and again we go into the limited resources area. And maybe the last thing, linked to what the previous panel mentioned, in general everybody has a problem of accessing climate data in an open manner and understand how to use them. Because again, as Roman was saying before, this is a very technical process. And also this is an area where we are experimenting with Copernicus as EIB to try to use it first internally and make it available. There is plenty of data outside there, but simply doesn't get to the people that needs to use them, which are ultimately the designers, the consultants, and those that are actually promoting and designing projects. I'll stop here. Otherwise, do you want to continue?
Just how much time do we... For the session?
For the end of the session.
Okay, all right, be quick then. So, yeah, somewhere between my engineering and banking education, I made a detour into Plato and Chekhov. And when you see data presented, you obviously, at the back of your mind, you know that at some point, this has to convince someone. And we all know that people are not particularly rational, and people kind of co-opt a piece of data that they prefer. So in reality, when we're dealing with, maybe down back to coasts, we're talking about communities that are often somewhat alone with having to slog out these discussions. And for example, I mean, people don't really understand viscerally or even mentally the concept of a return period. We just don't function like that. And in fact, a lot of the discussions that take place at local level become quite tribal. And people focus very much on particular techniques rather than the solution. The other thing is that with MBS projects, you know, these are not necessarily, I mean, we saw mangroves. I mean, they're probably relatively cheap, I guess. But in Europe, we don't really have mangroves. So when we're talking nature-based solutions, we're typically talking something that is not that soft at all. You know, it can be large quantities of rocks or sand, or, you know, it's really quite expensive. Some of these solutions are more front-loaded in terms of cost, and some are more back-loaded. And and generally, and I think what you mentioned governance. I mean, the glaring thing, of course, is that we govern our coasts in a way that we keep them in the same place as they were last year. And that's, of course, not how natural coasts work. But we're kind of entering into this era of a coastline being a more of a living thing. And really, we don't have the governance framework to manage that or to ensure the funding of that, right? Just a pet peeve that most bankers have in these kind of discussions is that the words funding and financing are kind of used a bit interchangeably. And it's important to make the distinction because funding is actually who pays. And financing, while for a financier, we understand that that's that magic called a loan that bridges expenses and the funding. But in common parley, financing is money coming from somewhere else. And it brings it down to I think something that is a defining feature of dealing with coast, is that oftenly you're dealing with a situation where responsibilities are devolved, local capacity to deal with these issues is quite limited. You're going to have to convince a large number of stakeholders to part with their cash, but it would probably not be quite enough. You probably need some help from the outside. And often communities reach that conclusion perhaps a bit too quickly. And so a lot of projects are kind of developed with this initial already impulse. We can't possibly afford this, we need the state to pay. But from the state perspective, they really need these local communities to give it their Sunday punch, to see what they can mobilize to show that this is a good solution, it's got the buy-in, everyone's contributing what they can. That becomes an infinitely stronger argument if you're trying to get funding from the state or the region or something like that, right? Just a bit on the squiggly picture with the arrows, the systems analysis for this cost-benefit approach. I think what's really interesting about that is probably the mental image of the workshop where this is happening. I'm not sure I've ever looked at a systems analysis graph and quite spent the time required to understand it all, but that wasn't really the purpose, of course. The main purpose really is that whole process. You know, you often have a fossilized problem where people have been staring at each other for ages, maybe for a decade or 2 decades. And an exercise of that is a way of kind of swimming out, maybe adding new layers or even complexities to the problem before you swim back in and try to attack the problem, right? There's heaps you could say, but maybe on just funding. Now I've just pointed out that funding is the central point. In fact, there are tricks of the trade and pieces of legislation you can use. As I said, most governance frameworks are not really set up for this, but it doesn't mean there aren't techniques, and taxes is one. Land value capture is another form of taxation. Most of this, you know, digs far into the deepest, darkest recesses of the human mind, which is the value of your house. This is a pretty motivating factor. The other thing is, we have to recognize that, you know, some objections or some barriers are pretty legitimate, like affordability. And if we do get outside help, we need to be intelligent about how to solve the main milestone, which is the distribution of the funding burden. If you can use grants to, say, address the hot potatoes, which is the vulnerable population, for example, then in a way you free up maybe some of the bigger discussion and funding possibilities. Generally, in terms of how you present these things, we don't like to think about things we don't like to think about. And so when it comes to adaptation framework, which is all about painting a picture of a terrible disaster and so on and so on, we tend to park it as a separate discussion. And then it stands naked as a very expensive, most of the time pointless piece of infrastructure. I mean, most of this stuff isn't doing anything for 99.9% of the time. It's only when you have the event. And how do you get people to pay 100 million euros for a thing like that? Well, the answer is largely not to separate it out, but to put it in the context of whatever the local economic vision is. You know, put it as a prerequisite for all the wonderful plans you have in the same document, the same plan. And actually, if you put it that way, you quickly see that a lot of this adaptation structure isn't on an annual basis that crazy expensive, actually. I mean, compare it to a new school, or dredging a port, or dredging a new navigation channel, for example. I mean, these are also pretty expensive, right? So context really matters. Lots more to say, but I'll leave it at that.
Sorry, just to say very quickly regarding the question on cost, we do consider cost in the report, the assessment of the Dutch, of the dunes. So just to say that, to reassure the person online.
Thank you. I'm gonna leave the floor to Elizabeth. Just before we close, I just wanted to mention, let's consider this the beginning of a conversation. Reach out on LinkedIn to all of us. We'd be happy to continue this exchange. I see there is a question there. I don't know if we can take it.
I have plenty of time. However, there's a trip to be made this evening for many of you. And I know that you prepared really hard, because I know you were talking last night over dinner and prepared very well. So please do reach out to this wonderful panel this evening. So thank you, Marta. Thank you to the whole panel. Thank you very much. Oh, you can see, well, ignore my face, but next to my face is something that's very important. Do scan that QR code, because that is the brand new EIB Climate Adaptation and Resilience website. So please scan and download that immediately. That's very, very important. Now, the reason we don't have time for questions right now, but we do this evening over cocktails, is because on some of your badges you have a dot. It's either blue or green. And if you have signed up to the visit, there is the visit now to the Haliotis wastewater plant project, and Marco Berros and team. Is Marco in the room? Marco Berros? He's already outside. Wait, we have to rush. So for those who are going on that trip, you will have a dot on your badge. So join Marco and team, and they will guide you together with the other colleagues towards that plant now. Just before you do leave, do take everything with you. This place closes at 7:30, so bring everything with you. And then I was going to say more importantly, but it may not be more importantly, but tonight we do have at 7:30 onwards the event tonight at the Marriott. You also need to take your badges or you will not get in. So keep your badge with you at all times. Have fun, but be back here tomorrow for coffee at 8:30. Thank you very much. Thank you online.